Before we get started, please like and subscribe. Let me know where you're watching from, and you can support the channel by clicking thanks or joining. Ethan Ward had spent most of his career studying the boundary between consciousness and oblivion, convinced that the mind held untapped corridors only reachable in the thinnest moments before sleep. When the government funded Project Somnus, a covert initiative designed to test whether extended wake cycles could unlock deeper cognitive abilities, Ethan believed he had finally found the key to proving every theory he had ever dared whisper. What he did not know was that Somnus would instead become the doorway for something that should never have been awakened. The experiment required 5 volunteers, all carefully screened for mental resilience and physical durability. Their names were Hannah Cole, Marcus Dyer, Rachel Flint, Oliver Hayes, and Jonah Keane. Each carried their own reasons for signing up: a need for money, a hunger for scientific contribution, or simply the thrill of stepping into the unknown. They entered the facility expecting discomfort and fatigue, but none imagined terror. The rules were simple. No one was permitted to sleep for 30 consecutive days. A cocktail of stimulants would keep them awake, while a network of biometric sensors measured brain activity, stress levels, and micro-hallucinations. Ethan insisted strict supervision was mandatory. Sleep deprivation was unpredictable, but the military wanted results fast. Pressure shadowed him from the start. The volunteers spent their first hours exploring their sealed observation chamber. White walls, bright lights, and an air circulation hum that never dipped below a metallic throb. Cameras followed their movements with mechanical patience. An intercom allowed Ethan to speak to them, though only when absolutely necessary. He watched them from the control room behind reinforced glass, feeling more like a warden than a scientist. Still, the first day passed uneventfully. Ethan documented stable vitals and minor complaints. By the second day, the volunteers had already begun showing early signs of cognitive strain. Jonah reported phantom tapping noises behind his skull. Marcus said he kept miscounting his own breathing. Hannah laughed constantly at nothing, which unsettled the others. Ethan noted every anomaly, while superiors demanded he accelerate the stimulant dosage. It was far too soon for such intensity, and the ethical violation gnawed at him. Yet he complied. By day 3, subtle cracks widened. Oliver claimed the lights were pulsing in a rhythm mimicking a heartbeat. Rachel woke from a blackout she insisted was not sleep but a momentary disappearance of herself, as if she had stepped out of her own body, then snapped back into it. Sensors showed no sleep signatures, but Ethan could not deny the dread crawling beneath his ribs. Something about their brainwaves had begun shifting in ways he could not explain. The amplitude peaks were not consistent with normal human consciousness. They spiked in patterns resembling code-repeating structures that made no biological sense. He hesitated to report this anomaly, but the data did not lie. On the fourth night, alarms blared through the facility. Marcus was found standing motionless at the center of the chamber, eyes wide, lips moving silently. When Jonah approached him, Marcus whispered a sequence of numbers in his ear before collapsing. Those numbers, when Ethan later reviewed the footage, matched the irregular brainwave peaks on the monitors, as if Marcus had somehow heard the patterns as sound. When he regained consciousness, Marcus begged Ethan over the intercom to turn off whatever voice was speaking inside his head. Ethan assured him there was no voice, no transmission, but Marcus insisted someone or something was whispering from a place beyond the walls. The other volunteers avoided him for the rest of the night. Hours passed. Fatigue deepened into distortion. Hallucinations flourished in ways no stimulant cocktail should have induced. Hannah began tracing symbols on the floor with her fingernails, swearing they were letters in a language she had never learned. Jonah paced relentlessly, claiming shadows were watching him from corners that had no corners. Rachel refused to blink, believing blinking would allow something to climb into her mind. Oliver kept covering his ears as if blocking a thunderous roar that no audio device detected. Ethan watched everything, feeling a helplessness he had never known. The facility demanded results, but all he saw was the unraveling of 5 human beings, and perhaps the unraveling of something deeper in the human psyche. The worst occurred at dawn. Hannah suddenly screamed at the ceiling so violently that every volunteer fell silent. She pointed at the overhead vent, insisting something was climbing through it. Sensors detected no movement, temperature, no change yet. Hannah saw something. Her voice cracked as she described a shape sliding across the great skin. Pale, glossy, and too smooth to belong to any living creature. No one else confirmed the sight, but terror had rooted itself in each face. Ethan confronted the security team. They insisted a hallucination, nothing more. But the motion sensors in the ductwork flickered for exactly 3 seconds. At the same moment, Hannah screamed, a reading with no source, a blip with no physical explanation. He replayed the footage again and again, hoping to find an error, but there was none. The volunteers now refused to sleep, even if they were allowed. Fear kept them awake more than stimulants ever could. Their eyes trembled. Their bodies shook, their speech fragmented. But what terrified Ethan most was their synchronization. 5 separate minds should have deteriorated differently, yet their hallucinations had begun overlapping. All claimed to hear whispers, speaking in a cadence eerily similar to the brainwave code. All saw movements, not in the corners of the room, but in the corners of their perception, a place where the eye could not directly look. Something waited there, something patient. As Ethan documented these events, his own equipment malfunctioned. Audio logs replayed backwards. Video frames glitched into distorted silhouettes for fractions of seconds. At one point, the monitor briefly displayed a face that did not belong to any of the volunteers or staff. Smooth, pale, featureless, except for a mouth that looked carved rather than grown. He froze, staring at the frame which vanished an instant later, returning to static. He told no one, fearing he would be removed from the project before uncovering the truth. What he had not realized was that the experiment had already passed the threshold of science and entered the realm of intrusion. The volunteers had not unlocked cognitive potential. They had opened themselves to something that lived in the blind spots of human awareness, something that thrived where consciousness frayed. The sleepless state had called it forward. Now it was watching all of them, and it had begun learning their names. Ethan Ward returned to the control room before sunrise, hoping a moment of solitude would steady his mind. Sleep had eluded him for nearly 36 hours, leaving his thoughts sluggish and grainy, yet still far clearer than the deterioration he was witnessing in the chamber. The volunteers had crossed a threshold he had never intended. Their hallucinations were no longer independent noise within fatigued minds. They had begun forming a shared landscape, a collective intrusion that behaved too deliberately to be random. Ethan booted up the monitoring arrays and felt the stale, recycled air of the facility press against him like an unseen weight. The chamber was dimmer than before. Overnight, the lights had flickered repeatedly, forcing technicians to reroute the power through auxiliary circuits. Even so, shadows pooled in unnatural shapes around the perimeter, as if the walls were no longer flush, but subtly warped. Jonah paced in slow circles, muttering broken phrases. Hannah sat curled in the corner, arms wrapped tightly around her knees, rocking as though humming a lullaby only she could hear. Marcus stared at the ceiling with a reverence that unsettled Ethan. Rachel crouched near the observation window, refusing to blink. Oliver lay on his back, eyes open, mouth slightly parted, as though listening to something at the exact frequency of fear. Ethan toggled the intercom. "Volunteers, how are your conditions this morning?" His voice cracked faintly. Rachel reacted first, snapping her gaze toward the speaker so fast it almost looked mechanical. "Something followed us into the dark," she whispered. Her voice carried no tremor, but it was the stillness of someone no longer anchored to certainty. Ethan asked her what she meant. She touched the wall beside her. "It is moving when the lights go quiet. It watches, it learns, and it does not want us to leave." Oliver sat upright, abruptly startling the others. "Do you not hear it?" he said, pressing his palm to his ear. "It talks in layers. It talks inside the bones of the room." Marcus laughed quietly, not in amusement, but in surrender. "It speaks in numbers," he said, "numbers that shape themselves into understanding. You just have to listen long enough." Hannah raised her head and glared at him. "Do not listen," she hissed. "Once you understand, you cannot unknow." Ethan muted the intercom. Their speech had become rhythmic, almost rehearsed, yet none of them had slept. This was not the chaotic unraveling of exhaustion. It was convergence, mindscapes merging at a frequency that should not have existed. He replayed brainwave logs from the past 3 hours. The peaks had grown sharper, thinner, like blades of light, slicing through normal cognitive patterns. At several points, The frequencies from different subjects aligned precisely, forming a pattern that resembled two intersecting spirals. It looked intentional. The security captain entered the room, startling Ethan. "Sunrise shift," he said. "Command wants updates every hour now. They think we are close to triggering whatever cognitive breakthrough they were hoping for." Ethan wanted to protest, but the captain continued. "Also, we caught a sensor anomaly in the northern duct. It changed temperature for exactly 6 seconds, then snapped back. No animals, no airflow shift. Nothing that should do that." His tone carried forced neutrality. Even hardened personnel were unsettled. Ethan returned his focus to the monitors. Inside the chamber, the volunteers had begun drifting toward one another, not speaking, not even looking at each other, but their movements synchronized subtly like marionettes pulled by strings from the same invisible hand. Their breathing aligned next, shallow inhales rising and falling in eerie unity. Ethan felt nausea coil inside him. He activated the intercom again, trying to break their trance. "Volunteers, please sit separately. You must not cluster." Hannah lifted her head slowly. Her pupils widened impossibly, black, swallowing the reflected lights. "It wants us together," she murmured. "It sees more through us when we stand close." Jonah jerked violently as though shoved by an unseen force. He stumbled to the far wall, clutching at his temples. "Make it stop, make it stop," he repeated. When Ethan asked what he heard, Jonah responded with a sentence that froze the entire control room. "It is trying to pull me out of myself. I can feel my name lifting away, as if something were attempting to peel identity like a fragile layer and take its place." Ethan ended the broadcast and signaled for a medical override. "Stimulant dosage must be reduced," he told the team. "They are disassociating beyond safe thresholds." A technician shook his head. "Orders from command are the opposite. Increase dose by 10%. They want the brainwave alignment to stabilize." Ethan stared at him incredulous. "That will push them into psychotic fragmentation. There is no cognition breakthrough on the horizon, only collapse." The technician avoided eye contact. "Direct orders," he repeated. Ethan slammed his hand on the console. He tried to override the command protocol, but authorization was locked. Someone above him wanted this to continue. Someone believed the phenomenon unfolding was intentional and worthy of further provocation. Ethan breathed deeply and turned his attention back to the monitors. Hannah had begun tracing symbols on the floor again. This time, the symbols were identical to the peaks in the brainwave pattern, not approximations, exact replications. Rachel placed her hand on the glass as though trying to reach Ethan. Her skin looked drained of warmth, almost translucent. "Do not let darkness come," she whispered. "Its waiting room is behind the places we do not see." Oliver moved beside her and whispered into her shoulder. "Tell him what you saw." Rachel trembled. "It walked behind Marcus last night, not in the room, in the place the room forgets to be. It is not a hallucination. It is an arrival." Ethan felt cold gather in the base of his spine. He unmuted. "Marcus, what did you experience?" Marcus smiled, a thin, empty smile. It leaned close close and tried to breathe me in. And when I tried to scream, it filled the sound with itself. Like my voice was a doorway it could step through. His expression shifted into fear. I think it almost succeeded. Alarms suddenly blared. The lights in the chamber died, plunging the volunteers into a dim emergency red glow. Static tore through the audio feed. In the darkness, a shape moved across one of the monitors, not like a person, not like any biological creature, but a distortion, an artifact, bending light around a hollow center. The security captain swore under his breath. "What is that?" Ethan stared, unable to speak. The lights flickered back on. The shape was gone, but the volunteers no longer stood where they had been. They had all turned in the same direction, their attention fixed on the vent high above. As though awaiting something, Marcus whispered, "It has found a place to enter." Hannah began crying. Jonah began laughing. Rachel held her hands over her ears. Oliver simply said, "It is awake." Ethan reached for the alarm override, desperate to initiate lockdown. Before he could press the sequence, every monitor simultaneously froze on a single frame. A face filled the feed, smooth, pale, featureless, except for a carved mouth, smiling so wide it stretched the notion of skin. The image flickered, then vanished, leaving only static. Ethan staggered back. The second shift of the experiment had begun, and whatever watched them now understood far more than it should. Ethan Ward stood frozen in the control room, long after the carved mouth vanished from the monitors. His mind struggled to reconcile what he had witnessed. Nothing in human neurology or visual hallucination could produce a synchronized image across every feed at the same instant. The presence that appeared on screen held no pixel artifacts, no distortion, no glitch trace. It had looked back at him knowingly, as if the experiment itself had become a beacon strong enough to call something through an invisible divide. He forced himself toward the console and reviewed live camera feeds. The volunteers still stood beneath the ceiling vent, staring upward with unnatural devotion. The emergency lights cast them in blood-toned shadows that stretched like tendrils across the floor. Their synchronization was no longer subtle. Their posture, their breath, their forward tilt all aligned with impossible precision. Human bodies did not move in perfect sequence without rehearsal. This was not choreography. It was occupation. Ethan activated the intercom. "Volunteers, look at me now. Respond." His voice carried urgent authority, but the subjects did not flinch. He repeated the command louder. Only then did Hannah turn her head slightly, her movements stilted as though resisting a stronger force. Her eyes glistened with tears, yet her expression remained vacant. "It wants to see through us," she whispered, "and when it learns enough, it will wear us." Rachel began tapping the floor with her fingertips. The rhythm was sharp, steady, almost mechanical. Jonah mirrored her pattern seconds later without looking at her. Marcus and Oliver joined moments after, 4 sets of fingers tapping in a unified beat that resonated through the chamber like a code being typed through flesh. Ethan quickly activated an audio analysis tool. The program detected patterns but could not classify them. A message, a structure, repeating intervals that resembled a countdown. The security captain re-entered the control room. "Reports from command are escalating," he said. "They want to know if behavioral unison can be weaponized. They think you're making progress." Ethan turned sharply. "Progress. They are losing themselves. There is an entity interacting with them. We must stop this before someone gets hurt." The captain lowered his voice. "We cannot shut down the experiment. Orders are locked. Only a containment breach would override command." As if the room itself heard those words. A sharp metallic clang echoed through the chamber speakers. All monitors flickered white for a second before stabilizing. The volunteers had stopped tapping, their heads turned toward the glass in perfect unison. They were all looking at Ethan. Hannah took a step forward. Then Marcus, then Oliver, Rachel, Jonah, their movements slow but determined. Ethan hesitated before unmuting the intercom. "What do you see?" Jonah answered first, though his lips barely moved. "It is behind you." Ethan spun instinctively but saw only empty control room space. Yet the temperature had dropped. A faint vibration pulsed along the floor as if something large and unseen shifted its weight. He turned back to the monitors. The volunteers had moved again, except he had not seen them take a single step. They now stood directly beneath the observation window, staring up at him, as though awaiting instruction. Oliver raised his hand and pointed at Ethan with slow, deliberate precision. Then he dragged his finger across his own throat. The motion was not a threat, it was a demonstration. Lights flickered, audio cut out. The emergency alarm blinked for half a second, then died. Ethan leaned closer to the console. System logs flashed with errors, unknown interference, data corruption, external signal detected. The words chilled him. External, not internal. A sudden crash erupted from the chamber. Rachel fell to her knees, clutching her skull. Oliver convulsed. Marcus pressed his palms against the wall, as though trying to hold something back. Jonah screamed so violently the microphones distorted. Hannah backed away from the others, muttering fracturing syllables of nonsense that still felt like language. Ethan slammed the intercom. "What is happening? Talk to me." Rachel looked up. Her voice cracked. "It is trying to settle into us. It needs space. It will hollow one of us out." Ethan watched sensors as each volunteer's neural activity spiked into unnatural peaks. Then the unthinkable happened. The brainwave patterns began merging into a single waveform displayed across all 5 biometric streams. It was no longer measuring individuals. It was measuring a collective mind. The control room door slammed shut unexpectedly. The security captain cursed and tried to override the lock. The console reported manual lockdown. Neither of them had initiated it. Ethan backed up as the lights dimmed further. Shadows lengthened across the walls at angles that defied the room's geometry. The floor vibrated again, harder. Ethan focused on the monitors. Something moved in the vent above the volunteers. Not a shape, not a creature, a distortion, a bending of space, as if the metal grate were a thin membrane being pressed from the other side. The surface bulged outward, pulsing like a heartbeat. Hannah screamed. "It is coming through." Ethan grabbed the emergency override key. He twisted it hard, initiating a forced chamber lockdown. steel barriers began sliding across the observation window. Before the final shutter sealed the view, Ethan saw something drop from the vent, a ripple in the air like heat waves but darker. It hit the floor with no sound and rose as though unfolding itself into the room. The shutter slammed closed. The control room filled with silence. Then everything shook. The chamber alarms wailed. The console flashed crimson. Containment breach. Containment breach. Ethan and the captain forced the lock and dashed into the hallway. The thick observation glass allowed no visual feed, but screams leaked through the barrier like something peeling apart from itself. Ethan pressed his ear to the reinforced wall. He heard the volunteers shouting, overlapping each other in a single twisted harmony. Then another sound joined them, a voice not human, not singular, not shaped by lungs. It echoed with layered tones like multiple beings speaking from one throat, and it said a word: open. The door lock clicked. The captain pulled Ethan back. Both stumbled away as the heavy chamber doors creaked, not from mechanical motors, but as if pushed by an unseen force. A narrow opening formed. Cold air spilled out, carrying a smell like static and old earth. No footsteps followed, but the volunteers no longer screamed. Their silence was worse. Ethan steadied his breath. We cannot let whatever is in there out. He reached for the manual override panel and began typing a sequence to force seal every corridor in the wing. The captain aimed his weapon at the opening, though they both knew a physical weapon would do little. The chamber door trembled, as if something pressed from behind it, deciding whether to emerge. Ethan completed the command. The entire hallway rumbled as blast shields began sliding into place. But before the first barrier descended, the door to the chamber swung fully open. 5 volunteers stood in the doorway, but it was not them anymore. Their posture wrong, their heads tilted at identical angles, their eyes the same shade of void. They moved like limbs of one body, and when they smiled, the carved mouth shape spread across all 5 faces simultaneously. Ethan whispered a single horrified thought. It chose all of them. The air in the hallway thickened as the 5 volunteers stepped forward in unison. Ethan Ward felt his muscles lock, despite every instinct urging him to flee. The figures standing before him bore the shapes of Hannah Marcus, Rachel Oliver, and Jonah, yet moved with a precision devoid of humanity. Their eyes were hollow voids, and their expressions stretched into identical carved smiles. Every breath they took occurred at the exact same interval, a synchronized inhalation that made Ethan think of puppets driven by a single hand. The security captain raised his weapon, though his trembling arms betrayed him. "Identify yourselves," he demanded. The response came not from one voice, but from all 5 speaking layered and perfectly aligned. "We are awake." The sound was a single chord of syllables wrapped around each other, harmonic and wrong. It thrummed in Ethan's ribcage like a tuning fork struck by invisible force. The captain took a step back. Ethan eased toward the emergency panel, unsure if motion would trigger aggression. The volunteers watched without blinking, their heads tilted tilted slightly in the same direction, following him with mechanical poise. Ethan forced his shaking fingers across the console, initiating a deeper lockdown sequence. Blast doors began to descend in the far end of the hallway, rumbling heavily. The volunteers turned toward the sound. They did not panic. They did not hurry. They observed. Rachel stepped forward first, then Oliver, then Jonah, Marcus, and Hannah. Their formation tightened until they were almost shoulder to shoulder. Ethan felt a pressure bloom behind his eyes, as if something pressed inward, attempting to breach his thoughts. He forced himself to focus on the captain. "On my mark, we run." He mouthed the words rather than spoke them, fearing speech might draw whatever intelligence lived inside those bodies. The captain nodded. Blast doors continued closing, sealing off escape routes, but also potentially trapping them with the entity that had taken over the volunteers. Ethan knew he could not let them reach the control wing. If the entity interfaced with the facility's systems, it could propagate beyond their containment. It could spread. The thought alone chilled him. The volunteers took another synchronized step, then another. Their movements glided without heel strike or weight shift, almost as though gravity affected them differently. When they reached the midpoint of the corridor, the overhead lights flickered. A pulse of darkness surged through the hallway. The carved smiles widened across their faces, though their mouths barely moved. It was as if the skin itself stretched on command. Ethan whispered the countdown. 3, 2, 1. He sprinted left. The captain sprinted right. The volunteers did not chase immediately. They simply watched, examining trajectories as though calculating which prey offered more value. Then they turned toward Ethan. All 5 bodies moved at once. Their speed was not superhuman, but consistent, unstoppable, like a tide that refused to slow. Ethan dashed around a corner and slammed his palm on the secondary access panel. The door slid open just enough for him to slip through before sealing. He leaned his weight against it, panting. The captain's radio crackled. "Ward, they are following your path." They ignored me completely. Ethan swallowed, the dread tightening in his throat. They are not targeting bodies. They are targeting something else. His thoughts spiraled. The entity communicated through patterns, waves, sequences. It might have identified something in Ethan's mind earlier when he studied the data anomalies. It might consider him a gateway or a threat. The hallway lights dimmed outside the sealed door. Ethan pressed his ear to the metal, listening. Silence. Not absence of sound, but a silence so deep it felt carved into the air. His breath stuck in his chest. He pulled away from the door. A soft, rhythmic tapping began on the other side, the same pattern the volunteers had tapped on the floor earlier. The code. It was communicating again. Ethan backed away slowly. The door rippled inward lightly, as if touched by something that should not have physical form. He stumbled and knocked over a tray of medical equipment. The clang echoed loudly. The tapping stopped. Another sound replaced it. A quiet breath exhaled through the seam of the door. No human lungs made a breath like that. It sounded layered, as though multiple exhalations occurred in one motion. Ethan forced himself to move. He needed to reach the central generator. Cutting power was the only option left. The entity relied on sensory input and structural systems. In complete darkness and electromagnetic silence, they might have a chance to isolate it, or at least slow its expansion. He hurried down a narrow passage leading toward the generator stairwell. The metallic steps shuddered beneath his feet. The facility felt alive now, responding to an intruder that bent reality's edges. Halfway down the stairwell, his radio crackled again. "Ward." They reached the door. They are not trying to open it. They are just standing there, all of them, staring. Ethan froze. Are they speaking? The captain hesitated, not speaking, listening. He could hear his own pulse through the static. Listening to what? The captain answered softly. "To you." Ethan gripped the railing until his knuckles whitened. The entity had linked them, echoed them, used them, and now it was tracking him through something deeper than sound or sight. He pushed himself into motion again, descending the last flight and emerging into the generator control bay. Rows of massive turbines roared with heavy rotation. Blue light flickered along energy conduits. The hum vibrated through the floor like a heartbeat too large for the building. Ethan rushed to the master control panel and began entering a power cut override. The system resisted. Protocol locks flashed across the display. Unknown user attempting override. Ethan gritted his teeth. It was not command. It was the entity using the volunteers to interface indirectly like a virus infecting a network through corrupted users. Another message appeared. Ethan Ward, do not run. His chest tightened. The system had displayed his name. Not programmed, not automated. The entity had typed it. He slammed his fist against the emergency release. Sparks shot from the panel. The generator output dipped. Lights across the bay flickered. The turbines slowed with groaning protest. Somewhere above the corridor, alarms wailed. His radio crackled with panic. Ward, Ward, they moved. They are coming toward the generator wing. All five. Ethan disabled his radio to silence the distraction. He sprinted up the eastern access ladder, avoiding the main hallway. He moved through maintenance shafts, cramped and dark but less exposed. He crawled through the narrow metal tunnel, listening as distant footsteps echoed below. Not footsteps, 5 pairs walking in perfect synchronization. He reached the upper exit grate and peered through. The volunteers stood at the far end of the corridor. Their heads snapped upward at the same time as though sensing him. Ethan felt the pressure in his skull again, stronger now. He pushed against the grate and dropped to the floor. The volunteers advanced. Ethan ran. He reached the main hub where 4 corridors intersected. The blast doors were closing slowly from the earlier lockdown. He had seconds. He sprinted into the hub and dove beneath the descending steel barrier. The volunteers were still on the far side. 4 of them stopped. 1 did not. Hannah stepped forward and placed her hand against the descending blast door. Steel bent under her touch, not from strength, but from a distortion in reality itself, warping the metal like softened wax. Ethan's eyes widened. The door creaked. Her carved smile stretched wider. Ethan lunged for the manual override lever beside him and yanked it downward. With a thunderous crash, the secondary barrier dropped from above, sealing the door completely. Screams echoed from the other side. Not human screams, not singular. The sound vibrated like chords collapsing into chaos. Then silence. Ethan collapsed to his knees, breathing hard. The captain's voice crackled faintly through restored comms. "Ward, are you alive?" Ethan swallowed hard. "For now, but it is not finished. It will find another way. It always does." Ethan Ward leaned against the cold steel wall, struggling to steady his breath. The blast doors had sealed, but he knew the silence behind them did not signal safety. The entity had not stopped. It had only paused, recalibrating itself around a barrier that slowed, but did not confine it. Ethan forced himself to rise. The facility still hummed with unstable energy, and the flicker of lights overhead hinted that the generator cutoff had not done enough. Something else pulsed inside the building. Something breathing between frequencies. He headed toward the auxiliary research wing where deeper system controls were housed. As he walked, the corridors felt narrower than before, as if the building were subtly tightening around him. The hum in the walls no longer resembled machinery. It sounded like murmuring, layered whispers drifting in and out of hearing. Ethan clenched his jaw and pressed forward. The researchers from earlier shifts had already evacuated or vanished, leaving the wing eerily empty. The moment Ethan accessed the corridor leading to the neural interface lab, the lights flickered violently. A gravity pressure wave rippled across the hall, bending the air like a heat distortion. Ethan stumbled back. Something was moving inside the electrical system, threads of motion crawling behind glass panels like veins writhing inside circuitry. He approached cautiously. The power conduits pulsed with faint luminescence, shifting into an unnatural rhythmic sequence, nearly identical to the brainwave patterns he had recorded from the volunteers earlier. The entity had infiltrated the infrastructure. He entered the neural interface lab, screens illuminated automatically filling the room with ghostly pale light. Then a chill swept down Ethan's spine. Every monitor displayed the same frozen image, the carved smile, the featureless face. But the smile was wider now, extending beyond where the skin should have been able to stretch. Ethan stepped backward as the monitors began to distort one by one, the carved mouth twitching like it was attempting to speak. The speakers crackled. "Ethan Ward." The sound crushed him with its density as though it carried weight. It was not spoken through electronics, but through vibration itself resonating in the bones of the room. Ethan forced himself to stand firm. "What do you want?" His voice shivered despite his attempt at authority. The reply came layered and cold. "To inhabit, to learn, to cross." Ethan swallowed hard. "You cannot cross into the world through them. The volunteers cannot sustain you." The entity laughed, not a sound, but an inversion of silence bending into shape. "They are suitable, but not enough. You offer more." Ethan felt a surge of pressure behind his eyes and dropped to his knees. His skull throbbed, as if something clawed inside, trying to peel apart the layers of his mind. He squeezed his temples and forced himself to breathe. The entity wanted him, not his body, his cognition. His understanding, the years he had spent studying consciousness, had made him a more efficient vessel. He crawled toward the emergency override terminal on the far side of the lab, dragging himself across the floor. The monitors tracked him, following his motion like dozens of watching eyes. He reached the console and initiated a hard system reset. The screens went black. The pressure in his skull dissipated slightly. He rose shakily. That gave him minutes, maybe less. He needed to reach the deep vault where the facility stored its most restricted technologies, including the neurological dampening field. If he could activate it, it might scramble the entity's interface long enough to sever its control over the volunteers. He exited the lab and moved into a service corridor that cut across the lowest level. The air grew colder. The floor vibrated with a strange pulse, like a massive heartbeat echoing through the foundation. Ethan quickened his pace, then he froze. Footsteps, 5 sets, approaching slowly in perfect synchrony. Ethan backed into a maintenance alcove dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. The footsteps drew nearer, measured and calm. He peered around the corner. The volunteers emerged from the far corridor. Their empty eyes glowed faintly with an internal red shimmer. Their bodies moved with fluid, unnatural precision. Hannah led the formation, her head tilted slightly, as if listening to something inside the walls. Marcus followed his fingers, brushing faint symbols along the steel. Rachel whispered soundlessly, lips moving in patterns. Oliver and Jonah mirrored each other's movements in eerie symmetry. Ethan held his breath. If they turned even slightly, they would see him. They stopped. Not because they sensed him, but because they sensed the vault. 5 heads turned in the same direction, facing the reinforced door at the end of the corridor, their motion smooth like synchronized marionettes. Ethan felt a pulse of cold dread. They knew where he intended to go. The entity was thinking ahead. Hannah raised her hand and pressed it to the vault door. Metal groaned under her touch, bending not from strength, but from spatial distortion. The door warped inward like heat softening steel. Ethan stepped from the alcove, his voice shaking. "Stop! You do not understand what is inside that vault. It will destroy you." All 5 volunteers turned toward him. 5 identical carved smiles spread across their faces. Ethan's blood froze. They stepped toward him slowly, not lunging, not rushing, but advancing with certainty. Ethan retreated step by step until his back hit the wall. The corridor flickered with red emergency lights. He had nowhere to go. The entity spoke again, using their voices. "Step into us." The pressure returned to Ethan's skull, sharper than before. He staggered and dropped to one knee. His vision swam. The volunteers approached, forming a semicircle around him. Their shadows merged into one shape against the floor, stretching outward like tendrils. Ethan forced himself upright and broke into a sprint, pushing past Jonah and Marcus. Their heads snapped toward him, but their bodies reacted a second slower. That hesitation saved him. He bolted down the hall, weaving through auxiliary rooms until he reached the lift shaft. The elevator was disabled, but the maintenance ladder remained intact. Ethan climbed rapidly, gripping each rung until his arms throbbed. Below him, 5 pairs of footsteps approached the base of the ladder. Then the volunteers began climbing, all of them at once. Ethan climbed faster, breath-ragged chest burning. The volunteers climbed with unnatural ease, their limbs moving like articulated joints on rails. They were gaining on him. He reached the next platform and leapt across the great landing hard enough to knock the breath from his lungs. He rolled to his feet and slammed the hatch shut behind him, locking it with a manual bolt. The volunteers reached it seconds later. 5 fists struck the hatch in unison, creating a booming metallic echo that shook the platform. The bolt bent. Ethan turned and ran. The vault was only 1 corridor away. He sprinted through the narrowing hallway, hearing footsteps behind him as the bolt finally tore free. The blast door to the vault loomed ahead. Ethan slid toward the access panel and slammed his hand onto the biometric reader. The door hissed open. He darted inside. The vault lights flared to life, revealing rows of sealed containment devices, each holding experimental technologies. At the center stood the neurological dampening core, a cylindrical device humming with dormant energy. Ethan rushed to it and threw the activation switch. The facility groaned. Lights flickered. A low-frequency pulse surged through the vault and into the corridors beyond. Footsteps stopped, then a scream. Not 5 voices. 1, a single unified howl of something forced out of alignment. Ethan exhaled, shaking. The entity had been slowed, not stopped, but slowed. Enough for him to continue the fight. The neurological dampening core pulsed again, sending another tremor through the reinforced vault floor. Ethan Ward braced himself against the metal railing as the vibration rippled up through his arms. The hum deepened like a low thunder trapped inside the earth. Above him, the overhead lights flickered wildly before stabilizing into a dim but steady glow. For the first time since the entity emerged, the facility felt like it was resisting rather than surrendering. He forced himself to stand tall despite the burning fatigue weighing his limbs. The dampening field could not last long. It drew immense power from the backup grid, and the generator had already been compromised earlier. It gave him minutes, not an hour, not even half minutes to act before the entity adapted or broke through the interference and reclaimed full control of the volunteers. Footsteps echoed faintly beyond the vault door, sporadic, uneven, not the perfect synchronized cadence the entity had used before. The field was disrupting its control, but the steps were still approaching. Ethan swallowed a surge of dread. The volunteers were not immobile. They were fighting the dampening pulse with raw determination, driven by something that did not care about the limits of flesh. Ethan moved deeper into the vault toward the containment terminal. He needed access to the prototype devices stored here. He skimmed the rows until he found the one he needed, a compact neural disruption module sealed in a transparent case. The device was experimental, illegal, and untested on living subjects, but it had one feature that mattered. It targeted external influences on brainwave patterns. by amplifying the user's natural cognitive frequency. If Ethan could boost his own mental signal, he might become unreadable to the entity, invisible to it, or at least harder to control. He opened the case and retrieved the module. It was cold, too cold. The metal hummed faintly as though eager to activate. Ethan tightened his grip and moved toward the workstation. He could hear the volunteers outside the vault now. Their steps dragged across the floor, lacking their earlier fluidity. They were struggling. That should have comforted him. It did not. A wounded predator was still a predator. The vault door trembled. Ethan froze, staring at it. A moment later, a heavy impact struck the steel barrier. Then another, slow, deliberate blows that did not rely on physical force, but warped the metal through spatial distortion. The same phenomenon he had witnessed earlier when Hannah twisted the reinforced door like softened clay. The dampening field weakened that ability but did not nullify it. He rushed to the workstation and connected the neural disruption module. The console lit up, power stable. Pulse calibration required. Ethan attached the sensor nodes to his temples. The device hummed. His heartbeat accelerated. The vault door shook again. This time, the metal buckled inward, forming a shallow dent. A low, multi-layered growl seeped through the entrance, not voiced by human throats, not shaped by lungs. It rumbled through the steel like vibration breaking free. Ethan activated the calibration sequence. A sharp pulse shot through his skull. He winced, but did not stop. The second pulse followed stronger, then a third. The machine adjusted automatically, syncing itself to his biological signature. The room dimmed around him as the device drew more energy. Sound muffled, air thickened, then everything sharpened. He gasped. His thoughts expanded like someone had lifted a weight he never realized he carried. The room came into focus with impossible clarity. Every vibration, every faint shift in shadows, every breath of air felt amplified. The neural disruption module had enhanced his perception, but it had also weakened his body. His legs shook, his hands trembled. His breath came out in uneven bursts. He felt like a mind floating inside a failing vessel. The vault door dented again, deeper this time. A crack formed along the upper hinge. A distorted voice bled into the vault. Ethan. The name came as a layered whisper fractured across multiple tones. Step into us. This is the crossing. Ethan backed away, gripping the workstation for balance. His enhanced perception made the entity's voice unbearable. It echoed inside his skull as though bouncing off the walls of his mind. He pressed both hands against his head and forced his thoughts into a narrow, focused beam. He cleared his breathing and centered his awareness. He needed control, precision, willpower. A deep metallic snap echoed across the vault. The hinge tore halfway off. Ethan had seconds. He scanned the vault quickly. Shelves stacked with forbidden prototypes, transcranial amplifiers, disruptive pulse grenades, cognitive scramblers. He grabbed a compact pulse projector from the nearest shelf. If he timed it right, he could blast the entity with a physical neural shock when the door broke open. It would not destroy it, but it would disorient it long enough to buy one more minute of survival. The door caved inward. A hand hand slipped through the opening. Not a hand, a distortion shaped like one. The air rippled around it, bending light in unnatural patterns. A moment later, Hannah's face pressed into the gap, her eyes vacant, her smile stretched too wide across her cheeks. Ethan's breath hitched. 4 more faces appeared behind hers, all hollow, all smiling, all wrong. The door peeled open further, and the 5 volunteers stepped into the vault. They moved unevenly, inhibited by the dampening field. Their heads twitched, their limbs jerked, but their carved smiles never wavered. The entity forced them forward. Ethan raised the pulse projector. His hands shook, his vision blurred. The neural disruption device strained his body. A cold sweat trickled down his neck. The volunteers advanced. Another ripple of pressure surged through the vault. Then something unexpected happened. Rachel broke formation. Her face twitched. Her body jerked away from the others. She clutched her skull and fell to her knees. A strangled cry escaped her throat. Not layered, not the entity, human, painful, real. Ethan staggered forward. "Rachel, can you hear me?" She lifted her head. Tears streamed down her face. "It hurts. It hurts. Help me." The entity reacted instantly. The other 4 volunteers lunged at her, their movements jagged, violent. Ethan lifted the pulse projector and fired. A sphere of concussive energy exploded outward, rippling through the vault like a silent shockwave. The volunteers were thrown back. Rachel collapsed, fully unmoving. Ethan sprinted toward her. Marcus and Jonah writhed on the floor, twitching from the neural blast. Oliver struggled to stand. Hannah recovered fastest, her head snapping toward Ethan with the precision of a hunting predator. She lunged. Ethan grabbed Rachel by the arms and dragged her across the vault floor. His muscles strained. His breath broke. Hannah closed in. Ethan fired another pulse. It hit her square in the chest, sending her crashing into a containment rack. The neural disruption module throbbed painfully inside Ethan's skull. Black spots filled his vision. His legs buckled. He dropped beside Rachel, gasping. The entity roared, not with sound, with pressure. The vault trembled. Shelves rattled. Metal bowed. The dampening field flickered. Ethan forced himself upright. Rachel's eyes fluttered. She whispered one word, "Run!" Ethan grabbed the pulse projector and staggered toward the emergency exit on the opposite wall. The volunteers screamed behind him as the entity regained control. The vault door groaned. The dampening field faltered. The entity surged forward, and Ethan ran into the unknown darkness ahead. The emergency corridor swallowed Ethan Ward in total darkness as the vault doors slammed shut behind him. The sound echoed through the metallic passage like a dying breath, long and hollow. He staggered forward, pulse projector gripped tightly in one trembling hand. Rachel's faint breathing still echoing in his ears. The neural disruption module throbbed at his temples with every heartbeat, amplifying his senses until the corridor felt alive, vibrating with the tension of something waiting out of sight. He forced himself to keep moving. The corridor leading away from the vault was never meant for personnel. It was a structural maintenance path, narrow and winding, built deep within the bones of the facility. Ethan's footsteps sounded too loud, too sharp, as though the echoes themselves were trying to warn him he didn't belong belong here." The air was colder than before, each breath frosting faintly in front of him. The generators above groaned like something massive shifting its weight. Halfway down the corridor, Ethan stopped. The hallway was bending, not turning, bending. Its straight, linear architecture curved inward like softened metal, forming a warped crescent that defied the facility's blueprint. Ethan blinked hard. His vision was sharper than ever because of the disruption module, and the distortion wasn't a hallucination. It was physical. Reality had grown flexible, reshaped by an entity that didn't obey the boundaries of human geometry. He approached slowly. The curvature of the corridor pulsed faintly, like a living membrane stretched too tight. When his fingers brushed the wall, the metal felt warm, not warm like machinery, warm like skin. He recoiled instantly. A faint tremor rippled through the structure, then another. The metal vibrated as though responding to his touch. Ethan stumbled backward and raised the pulse projector instinctively. The corridor ahead shifted slightly, adjusting itself. Listening to him, he whispered, voice cracking, "What are you doing to this place?" The answer came not through sound, but through pressure behind his eyes, a familiar layered whisper folding itself into his mind. Crossing begins where shape breaks. Ethan pressed a hand against his forehead, fighting the mental intrusion. His thoughts flickered, stuttering like a glitched recording. The entity was adapting to the dampening field, using the facility structure itself as a conduit. Every moment he remained here gave it more pathways to him. He moved quickly now, navigating the warped passage as carefully as he could. The curvature grew steeper. The lights overhead flickered, then died completely, plunging the corridor into pitch blackness. Then soft footfalls echoed behind him. 5 sets, uneven but coordinated, growing louder. The volunteers were coming. Ethan tightened his grip on the pulse projector. He pushed deeper into the dark until a faint red glow appeared ahead. Emergency lights flickered to life at the far end of the warped hallway, casting erratic shadows that stretched unnaturally long across the walls. Ethan reached the glow and stopped again. The corridor did not open into a maintenance junction as it should have. Instead, it split into 3 separate paths, none of which existed on any blueprint. The walls of each path curved inward like rib cages. The emergency lights flickered inside each route, illuminating impossible angles and shadows that bent toward him, as though the hallways themselves were inhaling. Jonah's voice drifted from the left passage. "Ethan, help me." Rachel's voice came from the center. "Ethan, please, come back." Hannah's voice echoed from the right. "We can still be whole." But Ethan knew better. The voices were perfectly clear, perfectly pitched, carrying none of the strain he had heard in Rachel's real cry. These were projections from the entity, bait meant to lure him into a chosen vector. The neural disruption module thrummed violently, warning him. His mind felt stretched, pulled in multiple directions at once. He steadied his breath and closed his eyes. His enhanced perception shifted, filtering sensation the way the module forced it to. Beneath the false voices, beneath the layered mimicry, he sensed something else. Movement, real movement. Behind him, he spun. The volunteers stood at the far end of the corridor, framed in the dying red glow. They were not running, not lunging, just watching, their heads tilted in nearly identical angles, though the dampening field made their movements twitch slightly, imperfect and jerky. Hannah stepped forward. Her voice was not the entity's voice this time. It was hers, broken, exhausted, stretched thin. Ethan, it is inside everything. It sees through the walls. It sees you through us. Her face twitched, and the carved smile snapped back onto her lips like a mask being forced into place. Ethan fired. The pulse exploded down the corridor in a blast of invisible, concussive force. Hannah staggered to one knee. Marcus fell sideways. Jonah and Oliver slammed into the bending walls. Rachel crumpled again, clutching her head. Ethan took the center path. It wasn't a choice so much as instinct, the only path where the shadows recoiled. Instead of reaching for him, he sprinted through the curved passage as the entity boomed behind him, its layered voice rippling through the walls, crossing incomplete, vessel unstable. The floor shifted beneath Ethan, slanting as though the building were tilting. He stumbled, caught himself on the wall, and kept running. The metal beneath his hand pulsed like a heartbeat. Ahead, the corridor narrowed until it formed a tight throat-like shaft. He crawled through it. The darkness closed around him, suffocating, pressing against his back and chest. The sounds of the volunteers echoed faintly behind him, distorted by the shifting geometry. He pushed forward until he reached an opening and tumbled into a wide chamber he had never seen before. Except it wasn't a chamber. It was the facility's structural underlayer. I-beams stretched around him like the ribs of a colossal buried creature. Pipes vibrated with strange rhythmic pulses. The walls shimmered in places, glitching like a digital rendering failing to stabilize. The entity had fully infected this section. Ethan stood and scanned the room. At the far end was a maintenance elevator manual. Old, disconnected from most systems. Exactly the kind of device the entity would have the hardest time controlling. He ran toward it. The chamber groaned. A fissure ripped through one of the beams, bending inward as though something were pushing from the other side. Red light spilled from the tear, flickering like a slow heartbeat. Ethan didn't look back. He reached the elevator, yanked the gate open, and pulled the manual chain. The pulley system screeched to life, hauling the elevator upward. Below him, the volunteers entered the chamber. All 5 stopped and looked up, their hollow eyes locked onto him. Then, for the first time, their carved smiles vanished. All 5 screamed at once, not in pain, in rage, as though the entity was no longer amused. The elevator ascended into darkness as the chamber below began to twist, warp, and pulse like a living thing. Ethan's heart pounded as he whispered to himself, "It knows where I'm going." The maintenance elevator rattled violently as it climbed the vertical shaft, chains grinding against rusted pulleys that had not been used in years. Ethan Ward clung to the side rails, adrenaline pushing his trembling muscles past exhaustion. Below him, the chamber bent and warped like a living organism folding into itself. The screams of the volunteers echoed upward, a chorus of rage and distortion. The neural disruption module on his temples pulsed sharply, reacting to the entity's interference rising through the shaft. The higher he ascended, the narrower the shaft became. It felt as if the walls were closing in, compressing around him. Ethan's breathing turned ragged, and he tightened his grip. The emergency lights flickered unpredictably, illuminating sections of the shaft that bent in ways steel was never designed to bend. The structure shivered, humming with a frequency that did not belong to machinery. Halfway up, the elevator jerked violently. Ethan lost his footing and slammed into the grated floor. Sparks burst from the pulley above. The elevator swayed, suspended by a single chain that groaned under the sudden load. Ethan scrambled to his knees and grabbed the handrail again. The chain stretched. A metallic snapping sound echoed through the shaft. The elevator dropped only a foot, 2 feet, then stopped abruptly, jarring Ethan's spine. He gasped and looked up. Above him, a section of the chain pulsated, as if something had gripped it. The metal writhed unnaturally, twisting in ways no physical force could explain. Then he heard it, a whisper, not through the air, through the steel. "Ethan," the voice rippled through the shaft, vibrating the elevator platform beneath him. He staggered backward, pulse projector raised. The walls around him glowed faintly with a red shimmer, as if veins of light had seeped into the structure. The entity was close, closer than ever. Ethan gritted his teeth. "You cannot take me." He barely recognized his own voice, strained but fierce. The disruption module hummed in agreement, amplifying his defiance. The response came instantly. "You are already taken." Wind blasted upward through the shaft, impossibly strong, carrying a roar that sounded like mechanical grinding mixed with human breath. The elevator trembled violently. Ethan braced himself and pressed the manual chain control. The pulley screamed as the elevator resumed climbing, but now the ascent was agonizingly slow. Ethan checked the panel manual. Override had cut power to all automated systems. The elevator was running on minimal mechanical resistance. It would take minutes to reach the upper access door. Minutes he did not have. He peered down the shaft. Darkness churned below him. Not empty darkness. A moving one. A shifting one. It crawled upward, reforming itself into the twisted silhouettes of the volunteers. Their limbs elongated unnaturally, bending backward as they ascended the walls like inverted spiders. Their eyes glowed faintly with internal red light. Hannah's voice rose from the depths. "Ethan, we are still here." Rachel's voice followed. "Do not leave us behind." "Oliver, you belong with us." "Jonah, let us inside." And Marcus's voice broke through them all. "You cannot outrun what you awaken." Their voices dissolved into layered distortions, turning into the entity's unified tone. Ethan fired downward. The pulse projector erupted in a concussive blast that tore through the shaft. The air rippled violently as the shockwave smashed into the malformed figures below. Screeches filled the shaft as the volunteers fell back into the darkness, limbs snapping against the metal. Ethan exhaled sharply, not in relief, in desperation. The elevator groaned as it rose toward the upper access hatch. Ethan looked up, and froze. Something waited at the top. A shape crouched above the hatch, clutching the metal grate. But it was not one of the volunteers. It was not even shaped like a person. Its body was an outline bending inward and outward, flickering like a shadow rendered in broken geometry. Its head twisted at an impossible angle, observing him with interest. Ethan raised the pulse projector. Before he could fire, the shape leaned down and whispered, "You should not have climbed." The hatch above bulged inward, as though struck from the outside. Metal warped, groaning under pressure. Ethan held his breath. The shape at the top blurred, splitting into multiple shadows overlapping each other, forming humanoid silhouettes that flickered in and out of existence. The elevator jerked again. Ethan fired. The pulse blast struck the distorted silhouette. It scattered like smoke shredded by wind, fragments dissolving into the steel frame of the hatch. The metal shimmered unnaturally, but the obstruction was gone. The elevator finally reached the top. Ethan threw the latch open and crawled onto the upper platform. Breathing heavily, the moment he stepped out of the elevator, the entire shaft groaned behind him. He turned just in time to see the walls twist violently inward, collapsing around the elevator as though swallowing it whole. He staggered back from the edge. The shaft sealed itself. Ethan was now in the upper maintenance deck, an abandoned level that connected to only one functional section of the facility, the observation wing. If he could reach the central control node there, he could trigger a full system purge and sever the entity's influence entirely. But the wing was the most exposed section of the building. The entity would know he was heading there. He pushed forward. The deck was covered in dust, untouched for years. Pipes hummed with faint residual energy. The air smelled stale, as if the oxygen here had not been disturbed in a decade. Ethan had taken only 3 steps before the lights flickered overhead. A cold wind swept through the corridor. Then the sound came. Soft footsteps, not behind him, in front of him. He raised the pulse projector and moved slowly. The hallway ahead was dim, illuminated only by failing overhead lights casting long shadows across the cracked floor. He advanced carefully, each breath loud in his ears. Then a figure walked into view. Ethan froze. At first glance, it looked human, tall, slender, moving with a slow, graceful motion. But as it approached, the details became wrong. The limbs were too long, the joints bent too smoothly. The face was smooth, pale, and featureless, except for the mouth, carved, wide, smiling. Ethan's pulse quickened. He pointed the pulse projector at it. The figure tilted its head, curious. Then it stepped aside. Behind it stood 5 more figures, the volunteers, their bodies twitching but standing, their eyes empty, their mouths stretched into carved smiles. The entity spoke through all of them at once. You climb, you run, you resist, but every corridor leads back to us. Ethan stepped back. The volunteers stepped forward. He turned and ran toward the only place left to go, the observation wing, where everything had begun and where something waited for him to finish the crossing. Ethan Ward sprinted through the upper maintenance deck, each footfall bouncing through the hollow metal beneath him like a warning drumbeat. The volunteer's footsteps followed, slow but inevitable, matching each of his turns with unbroken precision. The entity no longer hid behind illusions. It was pursuing openly, certain he had nowhere left to run. And, in a way, it was right. The only path forward was the observation wing, the original heart of Project Somnus, the place where everything had first ruptured. The maintenance deck narrowed into a steep ramp leading downward. Ethan gripped the handrail, sliding the last few feet as the shadows behind him stretched unnaturally long. Reaching, the neural disruption module pulsed on his temples, struggling to filter out the psychic pressure building in the air. His vision flickered. He stumbled, breath catching, but forced himself upright. He reached the bottom of the ramp and froze. The observation wing had changed. It used to be a simple, sterile corridor. Now it sprawled like a skeletal cathedral, its ceiling towering far above where the architectural limits should have been. The walls bent inward at impossible angles, forming jagged arcs like ribs. The air was thick with a faint red glow, pulsing in slow, deliberate rhythm. Monitors lined the walls, each one flickering with distorted images from the experiment. Faces stretched, shadows writhing, brain waves repeating patterns that now looked like symbols rather than data. Ethan stepped forward cautiously. The floor creaked beneath him as though reacting to his weight. Monitors to his left blinked simultaneously, showing not the volunteers but Ethan himself, dozens of versions of him, each captured at different moments inside the facility, running, screaming, collapsing, staring into darkness. Then a final image appeared, him standing in the observation wing, but he had not reached that position yet. He swallowed hard and continued. As he approached the central chamber, the pulse projector warmed in his hand. The temperature in the wing changed abruptly cold in one step, blistering hot the next, as if he were walking through overlapping climates, bleeding into each other. The structure groaned around him, metal straining like a creature taking breath. Then the central door slid open on its own. The observation chamber, the room where the volunteers had lived through the first days of the experiment. The room where the entity had first slipped through the thin veil of sleepless consciousness. Ethan stepped inside. The chamber was empty, mostly. The bright white lights had dimmed into a sickly crimson, casting the entire space in muted shadows. The biometric chairs were overturned. Cables slithered across the floor like veins. The glass observation window remained intact, but its surface rippled, as if the glass were struggling to keep its shape. Ethan approached it slowly. His reflection looked back at him, then blinked independently. He stumbled backward, pulse projector raised. The reflection pressed its hands against the glass, mimicking nothing Ethan was doing. Its mouth opened in a wide carved smile. Then the reflection leaned forward until its head pressed through the glass surface without breaking it. A hand emerged. Ethan fired. The pulse blast cracked through the chamber, distorting the air and slamming into the reflection creature. It recoiled violently, snapping back into the glass like a reversed projection. The surface went still, but the entity spoke through it, voice trembling through the observation window like a vibration. "You stand where we crossed." Ethan backed away, scanning the chamber. The monitors along the walls came alive one by one, each Each screen flickered with the same carved mouth face staring back. The more screens that activated, the louder the whispering grew. Layered tones, multiple voices, a chorus of thoughts vibrating inside the walls. He covered his ears, but the sound was inside his skull. Crossing is incomplete, vessel not aligned. Awake, 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 Ethan shouted through the noise. You cannot fully inhabit them. Their minds cannot hold you. The monitors glitched. The whispering twisted into a deeper, stranger tone. Not them. You. Cold terror washed through him. He staggered, trying to breathe. The neural disruption module pulsed violently, struggling to shield his mind. The entity pressed against the edge of his consciousness, like fingers trying to pry apart the folds of his thoughts. He fell to one knee, his vision blurred. Back in the hallway, footsteps echoed. 5 pairs, slow, patient, inevitable. The volunteers entered the chamber. Their bodies twitched under the strain of the dampening field, but their eyes were fixed on him, hollow and expectant. Hannah stepped forward, her expression twitching between her real face and the carved smile that did not belong to her. Ethan, please, her voice cracked. Genuine fear, a piece of her still inside. Then the entity yanked control back. Her head snapped to the side. The carved smile reformed. Marcus stepped forward next. His voice was not his own. We learn through you. You opened the door. Oliver, you held it open. Jonah, crossing begins in thought. Rachel, and thought is where you are weakest. Ethan forced himself upright. The pulse projector hummed with a rising charge. He raised it toward the volunteers, but something else moved in the chamber. Behind the glass observation window, a silhouette, larger than the volunteers, larger than any human. It pressed against the trembling glass, distorting it like liquid. Its limbs stretched into long, jagged forms. Its head twisted sideways, forming an impossible angle. Its mouth carved itself into the familiar too-wide smile. Ethan whispered, "No." The glass bulged outward, cracked, splintered, shattered. The entity stepped through the broken window, not falling, but bending through reality itself, like stepping between 2 overlapping worlds. Its featureless skin rippled with shifting symbols. The same symbols the volunteers had traced, the same patterns the brainwaves had displayed. Its presence bent the chamber around it, walls warping in and out as though the room itself were breathing in terror. The volunteers dropped to their knees in worship. The entity extended a hand toward Ethan. "Step into the crossing." Ethan fired. The pulse blast hit the creature dead center. It didn't fall, but it staggered. Its form flickered violently like a corrupted rendering snarling from inside a failing machine. The volunteers screamed as their bodies spasmed under the pulse resonance. The entity reeled, trying to stabilize itself. Ethan ran. He sprinted toward the side exit, pulse projector overheating in his hand. The chamber shook violently as the entity regained balance. The volunteers lurched after him, crawling unnaturally fast across the floor. Ethan reached the exit door, slammed the manual override, and burst into the adjoining hallway. Behind him, the entity roared, its voice shattering the lights in the corridor. Ethan ran as the observation wing collapsed behind behind him, metal bending inward like a throat closing. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had seconds before the entity found him again. Seconds before the crossing completed, Ethan Ward ran through the collapsing corridor, metal groaning overhead like a wounded machine. The observation wing behind him twisted in on itself, bending and tearing as though the entity were reshaping the structure to follow him. He didn't look back. He couldn't. Every nerve in his body told him the entity was inches behind him, its presence crawling along the walls like a living shadow. The hallway split ahead into two paths. Neither existed on the original facility blueprint. Ethan hesitated only a second before choosing the left passage. The walls pulsed with red light, beating in a slow, rhythmic pattern that felt disturbingly like a heartbeat. The neural disruption module on his temples vibrated sharply, buzzing with static that made his vision flicker. He pressed forward, gripping the pulse projector tightly. It was hot now, the metal almost burning his palm. The device was nearing its limit. He had one, maybe two shots left before the internal coil overloaded, but he didn't need much more. He just needed time to reach the server core. Time to find a way to sever whatever tether allowed the entity to anchor itself inside the facility. The passage bent sharply, revealing a wide, circular junction he had never seen before. The ceiling towered high above him, arched like the dome of an ancient cathedral. Screens covered the walls, each flickering with different images. Ethan's heart lurched as he recognized them footage of the volunteers before the experiment began, laughing, eating, filling out paperwork, shifting nervously in their seats. Then another set of images replaced the first, footage of Ethan, his early days in the project, his research notes, his private conversations, and finally, recordings from minutes ago, his sprint through the observation wing, his firing of the pulse projector, his collapse in the collapsing hall. The screens showed him in angles impossible for any recorded device to capture. Then all the screens froze, all displaying the same image. Ethan standing exactly where he stood now, except the version on screen was smiling, a carved, too wide smile. His stomach dropped. Not a hallucination, not an echo. The entity was now using his image to speak. The screens flickered. The smile widened further. Then the voices came layered, vibrating through the room. You built the threshold. You tore the seam. You opened what should have stayed closed. Ethan backed away. His pulse quickened. Shut up. The screens shifted again, flickering through memories that didn't belong to Ethan. Shadows of dreams he had never dreamed. Nightmarish landscapes filled with twisting geometry. Places without light or walls. Things crawling through gaps in perception. The entity was showing him where it came from. Not a realm, not a dimension. A frequency accessed when consciousness is forced into sleepless collapse. A mental crack between wakefulness and dreaming. And Ethan had forced 5 human minds into that crack. A blinding surge of guilt hit him. He stumbled back until he struck the curved wall behind him. His breath trembled. He whispered, "It was not meant to open anything." The screens flickered violently. Intention is irrelevant. Impact is absolute. A metallic creak echoed from the passage behind him. The volunteers were coming. Ethan forced himself toward the far side of the junction, where a maintenance ladder led downward. He climbed quickly but carefully. The metal rungs vibrated beneath his hands, as though reacting to the entity's presence. When he reached the lower level, he found himself inside a narrow corridor filled with pipes that hissed with steam. This section was familiar, the access corridor leading toward the server core. If he could reach it, he could initiate a network purge capable of scrambling every connected system. It might sever the entity's influence for seconds, but seconds were enough. He turned the corner and stopped cold. The entity stood at the far end of the corridor. Not the volunteers, not its projections through glass. The entity itself, its form was barely contained within the narrow hallway, distorting the space around it. Its limbs arched at unnatural angles, dragging along the walls without touching them. Its torso rippled with shifting patterns, like symbols etched in liquid shadow. Its head rotated too far to one side. Studying him, its carved smile widened. Ethan raised the pulse projector. The entity didn't move. Its voice pierced the corridor, vibrating through the pipes and into his skull. "You approach the crossing point." Ethan gritted his teeth. "I will not let you enter our world." The entity tilted its head the other way. "We are already inside your thoughts." The projector hummed violently in his grip. Ethan squeezed the trigger. The pulse exploded down the corridor. The entity absorbed it. The blast rippled around its form as though passing through fog. The symbols along its body shimmered briefly, reacting more out of curiosity than pain. Ethan's stomach sank. The pulse projector hissed, then died. Overheated, the entity stepped forward slowly, deliberately, as though savoring the moment. The metal walls twisted with each of its steps, bending like soft clay. The corridor shrank, compressing around Ethan. He backed away, searching desperately for an escape. Then he spotted it, a small emergency duct overhead, barely wide enough for a person. He leapt, grabbed the grate, and ripped it open. The metal slashed his palm, drawing blood, but he ignored the pain and hauled himself inside. The duct shook violently as the entity reached the corridor beneath him. Ethan crawled fast, heart pounding. The duct was pitch black except for the faint red glow pulsing through the walls. Behind him, metal bent. Something pressed upward from below, denting the duct's underside. The entity was following. Ethan crawled faster. The duct split ahead. He took the right path, hearing the left collapse behind him as the entity forced itself upward. The walls rippled like muscle tissue. The air thinned. The pressure inside his skull intensified. He gritted his teeth, forcing his body to keep moving. The duct ended abruptly in a vertical drop. The server core chamber lay directly below. Ethan didn't hesitate. He dropped. The fall wasn't far, but he landed hard on a steel grate, pain shooting up his leg. He rolled away just as the ceiling above him buckled inward. The entity did not emerge, but its presence pressed through the structure like a hand pushing against fabric. Ethan staggered toward the central console, a massive ring of screens surrounding a humming cylindrical tower of light. The air here buzzed with electrical energy. Sparks danced along the floor. He reached the console and slammed his hand onto the manual override. "System purge ready. Initiate." Yes, no. His finger hovered. Behind him, the ceiling cracked open. The volunteers dropped into the chamber, bodies twisting unnaturally as they landed, their carved smiles visible even in the flickering light. They rose slowly, heads tilting in perfect unison. Ethan closed his eyes and pressed yes. Alarms erupted. White light surged from the central tower, exploding outward in a wave that consumed the room. The volunteers screamed. As their bodies jerked violently, the metal walls shimmered. As the purge signal blasted through every connected system, the entity roared, not from its throat, from everywhere. The chamber shook violently as the purge tore through the facility like a cleansing fire. Ethan braced himself as the world dissolved into light. Light consumed everything, a white brilliance so intense it burned through Ethan Ward's retinas even with his eyes squeezed shut. He staggered backward as the purge signal roared through the server core, a shockwave of raw data and electromagnetic force vibrating through the chamber. The floor shook. The air shivered. The sound was not noise, but pressure, a crushing weight of collapsing frequencies. Then everything went silent. Not quiet, silent. A silence so absolute it felt like the world had forgotten how to exist. Ethan opened his eyes slowly. The chamber was gone, not destroyed, not collapsed, gone. In its place stretched an endless white plain, smooth and featureless, as if reality had been erased and replaced with blank light. No ceiling, no walls, no machinery, no shadows, just endless white, bright enough to illuminate, but not bright enough to hurt. Ethan stumbled forward. His pulse projector had vanished. The neural disruption module was still on his temples, humming faintly, but its lights flickered unpredictably like a dying heartbeat. He turned slowly in a circle. No volunteers, no entity, no facility, just emptiness. A cold dread crawled up his spine. Had he died? Was this the entity's world? Or was this a mental space created by the purge itself, a temporary void? A reset, a whisper drifted across the empty plain. Ethan, he spun. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. It echoed within his bones rather than the air. He took a hesitant step forward. A figure emerged in the white. At first it was a silhouette, soft, indistinct, wavering. Then it sharpened. Rachel. Her face was pale, her eyes glimmering with faint awareness. She stepped toward him slowly, not twitching, not convulsing. Her movements were human again. She lifted a trembling hand. Ethan, is it really you? He rushed to her, steadying her as her legs buckled. She felt solid and warm, not a projection, not the entity, human. Rachel leaned into him, breathing shakily. What is this place? I cannot hear them anymore. It is quiet. Yeah, Ethan whispered. Too quiet. The plane trembled slightly. Rachel looked around nervously. Where are the others? Ethan helped her stand upright. The purge must have severed the connection. Maybe they are somewhere else. Maybe they are free. A voice behind him said, "We are not free." Ethan turned sharply. The volunteers stood a few yards away, Marcus, Jonah, Oliver, and Hannah. They were no longer smiling, the carved smile. Their eyes were clear, faces exhausted but alive. They looked drained, hollowed out, as if held together by will alone. but they were themselves. Jonah rubbed his temples. Something is wrong. I can feel pressure behind everything. Marcus stared at the white horizon. This is not the facility. This is not Earth. This is between. Rachel's breathing quickened. Between what? Before anyone could answer, the plane rippled. A pulse of distortion moved across the ground, bending the white surface like water struck by an unseen drop. Ethan grabbed Rachel and stepped back. The volunteers formed a tight group. The ripple grew. Then the voice came again, layered yet soft. You cannot purge what is already inside the crossing. Ethan froze. The voice was not behind them. It was beneath them. The white plane cracked. Thin black lines spider-webbed outward from a point near Ethan's feet. The cracks spread rapidly, fracturing the perfect white into shards. Through the cracks, he saw something moving shadows, shapes, twisting geometries. The volunteers backed away in fear. Hannah shook her head violently. No, we made it out. We are out. The cracks widened. A dark hand gripped the edge. Not flesh, not bone. A shape that bent inward rather than outward, like a shadow folding in on itself. More fingers appeared, clawing upward. Rachel screamed. Ethan pulled her backward as the entity began forcing itself through the cracks of the white plane, twisting between realities like liquid shadow. Its head emerged, featureless except for the deep carved smile that stretched from one side to the other. Its presence bent the air, warping the smooth white surface around it. Ethan whispered, horrified. It followed us. The purge did not stop it. It only pushed it in deeper. The entity rose until half its body stood above the fractured surface. Its voice layered through the void. This space is thought, and thought is where you opened the way. The volunteers huddled closer. Jonah trembled uncontrollably. It wants Ethan. It always wanted Ethan. Marcus nodded grimly. He touched the patterns. He heard its frequency. That made him part of the crossing. The entity reached toward Ethan. Rachel stepped in front of him. No, her voice shook, but her stance was unbroken. You will not take him. The entity's head tilted slowly. You offer resistance. Rachel's jaw clenched. Her eyes narrowed. Good. The white plane shuddered violently. Ethan dragged Rachel away as the entity swung its arm downward, splitting the ground like soft clay. The volunteers scattered, running across the plane as cracks jagged toward them. The white horizon buckled. The world bent like paper tearing. Jonah fell first, his foot slipping through a widening crack. Oliver grabbed him just in time, pulling him back onto solid ground. Hannah and Marcus dodged collapsing sections of the plane as the entity advanced. Ethan's mind raced. The purge signal had forced them into a liminal space somewhere between consciousness and oblivion. If he could manipulate this space the way the entity did, maybe he could reshape it. But how? He was human. He was not built for this. The neural disruption module sparked violently. A shock ran through his skull, and suddenly Ethan saw the plane differently, not as white emptiness, but as patterns, symbols, brainwave structures. The same patterns he had mapped during the experiment. The same patterns the entity had used to communicate. This was not a void. This was architecture. architecture, a mental structure built from the combined cognition of everyone connected to the experiment, and Ethan could read it, maybe even shape it. He turned toward the volunteers. "I can hold it back, but not for long. You need to find the stable point in this space. A threshold, an exit." Rachel clutched his arm. "What about you?" Ethan looked at the entity gliding toward them, its limbs bending in slow, deliberate arcs. "I opened the door. I have to close it." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "Ethan!" The ground beneath them split again, forcing them apart. Rachel stumbled backward toward the others as Ethan slid toward another widening fracture. The entity reached for him, shadowy fingers stretching across the glowing cracks. Ethan closed his eyes, then reached inward toward the symbols, the patterns, the frequency of thought. The white plane responded. It rippled under his feet, forming a barrier of light between him and the entity. The creature recoiled slightly, its smile flickering. The volunteers yelled behind him. They found something, a shape forming in the distance. A doorway, a possibility. Rachel shouted his name. Ethan breathed once. "Steady." Then he turned to face the entity fully. "This ends with me." The entity lunged, and the white plane shattered into a storm of light and shadow. The white plane shattered into a cyclone of blinding light and twisting shadow, swallowing Ethan Ward whole. He felt himself torn in every direction at once, his thoughts scattering like shards of broken glass. For a moment he had no body, no breath, no shape, only motion, only noise, only the pressure of the entity lunging toward him through the fragmented void. Then the world snapped back. He hit solid ground, hard enough to knock the air from his lungs. Ethan gasped and rolled onto his back, blinking through the haze. Above him stretched a dark sky, not black, but a deep shifting gray, like storm clouds caught between forming and dissolving. The ground beneath him was not white anymore, but a cracked surface of faintly glowing lines that pulsed like circuitry. He pushed himself upright, dizzy but uninjured. He was no longer alone. A few yards away stood Hannah, Marcos, Oliver, Jonah, and Rachel huddled together, trembling. Behind them flickered a luminous structure that resembled a doorway made of woven light. It pulsed gently, as though breathing. Rachel saw him first. "Ethan." She rushed to him and pulled him to his feet. Her body shook with adrenaline, fear, and exhaustion. He squeezed her hand. The others gathered close. Jonah looked around with wide eyes. "Where are we now? If that white place was between, then what is this?" Marcus swallowed hard. "This looks like a thought structure, a deeper layer, a foundation." Hannah stared at the glowing ground. "No, this feels like a root system, something beneath everything else." Ethan stiffened. Then this must be where the entity grows. Before anyone could respond, a tremor rolled across the cracked ground. The glowing lines dimmed, then brightened, pulsing violently. A second tremor followed, stronger. Ethan steadied Rachel as she stumbled. Then the voice came, not loud, not aggressive, soft, close. "You followed us deeper." The volunteers spun around. The entity emerged from the darkness beyond the glowing fissures. Its shape was larger now, far larger than it had been in the observation wing or the white void. Here, in this deeper structure, it did not have to hide inside human geometry. Its limbs extended like elongated roots, branching and reforming as it moved. Its torso rippled with shifting symbols, brainwave patterns, neural maps, fractal spirals. Its carved smile cleaved across its face, deepening into a crescent that split almost to its chest. Rachel whispered, horrified, "It is stronger here." Ethan nodded slowly. "This is its origin point, or close to it. It is not invading our world from outside. It is growing out from a fracture inside consciousness." Jonah trembled violently. "Then this place is not real." Ethan looked around at the pulsing ground, the shifting sky, the trembling lines beneath their feet. "It is real, just not physical." The entity stepped toward them. "Awake, all of you. Wakefulness is the gate." Its voice vibrated through the ground, rippling through the glowing cracks. The volunteers steadied themselves, but their bodies shook from the resonance. Oliver clutched his head. "It is trying to pull us back into synchrony." Hannah gritted her teeth. "We cannot let it. Not again." The entity raised a hand of twisting shadows. "You will not resist." Ethan stepped in front of the volunteers. His legs buckled from exhaustion, but he stood firm. "Enough." The entity paused, curious. Ethan continued, "If this place is a thought structure, then it can break. It can change." The entity's smile widened. "Your mind is small. This place was built from many." Ethan shook his head. "But the threshold was opened by one, me." He clenched his fists. "And that means I can close it." The entity's body rippled with amusement. "Then close it." It spread its arms wide. "If you can." The ground beneath them cracked open. A massive fissure tore across the landscape, glowing violently. The volunteers scattered, diving away from the collapsing surface. Rachel grabbed Ethan's arm and dragged him backward as the fissure widened into a chasm. Ethan looked toward the shimmering doorway behind them, the possible exit. It pulsed brighter now, reacting to the catastrophic shift. It might close at any moment. Marcus yelled from across the gap. "Ethan, the doorway is responding to you. It reacts to your intent." Ethan's heart pounded. If he could direct the structure, he could reopen the exit long enough for the volunteers to escape. But not himself. The entity moved closer, its shadow stretching across the fissure. "You carry the frequency. You carry the breach. You cannot leave." Rachel shook her head violently. "No, no, we are not leaving without him." Ethan squeezed her hand once firm. "Steady." "Yes, you are." The chasm widened again, cutting him off from the rest of the group. Only Rachel remained close to him on his side of the divide. The others were stranded on the far end, shouting across the gap. Hannah cupped her hands around her mouth. "Ethan, use the symbols, the ones you saw in the white space. They belong to you now." The entity raised its head, irritated. Ethan felt the neural disruption module throb against his skull. When he closed his eyes, symbols formed behind his eyelids, spirals, arcs, pulses of meaning. He reached toward the ground. The glowing lines responded instantly. He felt the structure listening. Then he shaped a pattern. The ground obeyed. A bridge of light formed across the chasm, connecting Rachel to the others. Rachel stared at him in shock. "Ethan, you did it." Ethan nodded. "Go." Rachel grabbed his arm. "But you." He stepped back, Rachel's eyes filled with fear. "No, Ethan, do not do this alone." He gently pushed her toward the others. As soon as she stepped onto the bridge, the structure pulsed once, recognizing her as someone who could leave. Ethan smiled weakly. Rachel looked back at him, tears streaking her face. "Please come with us." Ethan shook his head. The entity's voice reverberated across the chamber. "He cannot leave because he is the door." Rachel screamed his name. Ethan did not respond. He turned toward the entity. Its carved smile stretched impossibly wide. Then the bridge of light began pulling Rachel toward the exit with the others, the structure guiding them automatically toward escape. Ethan faced the entity alone. "This ends here." The entity lowered itself, limbs spreading like roots across the ground. "Then let us finish the crossing." The glowing fissures erupted around them as the landscape shook violently. Preparing for a confrontation, only one of them would survive. The glowing fissures trembled under Ethan Ward's feet, each pulse sending vibrations through the cracked ground like a living heartbeat. Above him, the storm-gray sky twisted into spirals of fractal darkness, folding and unfolding as though the world itself were being reassembled. Across the luminous chasm, Rachel and the others were being pulled steadily toward the woven door of light, the exit that recognized their minds as separate from the threshold. But not him. Ethan stood alone on his fragment of trembling ground, facing the entity that had grown into a towering mass of shifting symbols and twisting limbs. Its carved smile stretched so far that the edges of its face seemed to split into more shadow than form. Every line of its body pulsed with meaning. He could almost decipher thoughts that were not thoughts, signals that were not sound, intent that was not intent. It existed both as shape and the idea of shape, as if perception itself were struggling to contain it. The entity lowered its head toward him. "You resist the crossing." Ethan steadied his breath. His knees trembled. His lungs burned, but he did not step back. "Someone has to." The entity's many limbs unfurled like black roots, spreading across the cracked ground in jagged arcs. Beneath them, the luminous lines dimmed, as if suffocating under its weight. "You are the breach. You are the opening. Through you, understanding expands." Ethan shook his head. "No, through me, it ends." The entity tilted its head, boneless and fluid. An unsettling curiosity filled the air. "Then close it." Its limbs slammed into the ground. The world buckled. The shockwave threw Ethan backward, skidding across the glowing cracks until he rolled to a stop near the edge of a widening fissure. Behind him, Rachel screamed his name, but her voice was muffled, distant, as though filtered through several layers of reality. Ethan pushed himself upright, teeth clenched, refusing to collapse. He looked down. His fragment of ground was shrinking. The fissures were spreading, fracturing the landscape into drifting pieces like a mental continent breaking apart. The entity towered above the chaos, unaffected. He focused on the glowing lines beneath his feet, the mental architecture he had glimpsed in the white plain. Patterns, frequencies, intent. He could shape them, bend them, maybe even weaponize them. Ethan inhaled slowly, forcing his shaking thoughts into structure. The symbols behind his eyelids flared to life. He reached toward the ground. The glowing lines responded. The fissure beneath him closed slightly, stabilizing the fragment. The entity paused, its smile twitching downward for a fraction of a second. Confusion. Ethan straightened. You are not the only one who can shape this place. The entity's head rotated fully backward, then snapped forward again. This place is not yours. It is born of many minds. You are a single point. Ethan lifted his hands slightly, feeling the trembling floor shift in response. Sometimes one point is all that is needed. The entity lunged. Its limbs shot outward like jagged spears, piercing the ground around Ethan and sending chunks of glowing stone spiraling into the void. Ethan ran, leaping across a fracture as the ground behind him collapsed. Light swirled beneath the falling fragments, absorbing them like a sea-eating islands. The entity moved with terrifying grace, its limbs bending and reforming around the collapsing terrain. It wasn't chasing him, it was herding him, shaping the weak points, forcing him where it wanted. Ethan slid to a stop at the edge of a massive sinking platform. The entity rose above him like a living storm. You cannot unmake the crossing. Its voice vibrated through his bones. The threshold is open because you believed something could be found beyond waking. Ethan clenched his fists. No, it is open because you wanted something to find us. The smile widened. We find what calls. Ethan exhaled sharply. That was the truth he had refused to acknowledge. The sleep experiment did not attract the entity. The entity had been waiting for someone like him, for someone who believed consciousness had undiscovered corridors, for someone who tried to pry open the boundary between dreaming and waking, and Ethan had been that person. He planted his hands on the glowing ground and focused harder. Symbols flared, brighter, stronger, vibrating with resonance. Behind him, the volunteers reached the woven door of light. Rachel looked back at him with anguish, her voice breaking through the distance. Ethan, please, come with us. He didn't turn to look at her. Couldn't. If he hesitated now, the entire structure would collapse inward, and the entity would complete its crossing. The ground beneath him pulsed violently. The entity spread its arms, symbols rippling across its twisted torso. Crossing is inevitable. Minds call to what they fear, and you feared the unseen. Ethan lifted his head. I am not afraid now. He pressed both palms to the ground. The architecture exploded in response. Light erupted from the glowing lines, branching outward in fractures of luminescent energy. The fissures snapped shut. The fragment beneath him expanded instead of shrinking. A shockwave of structured thought burst outward like a ripple of pure intent. The entity staggered for the first time. Its limbs writhed, losing cohesion. Its smile flickered. Ethan's voice cut through the trembling air. You do not control this place. Not anymore. You are a trespasser in our minds, not a master. The entity's body distorted violently, symbols fluctuating in panic. You cannot push us out. You cannot rewrite the crossing. Ethan forced himself to stand tall, even as the neural disruption module sparked painfully against his skull. dull. I am not rewriting it. I am closing it. His hands glowed with the same symbols that rippled through the ground. The landscape responded to him, folding inward like a massive, luminous lung contracting around a single point. The entity roared not in anger, but in terror. Your mind is insufficient. You will break. You will shatter. Ethan nodded slowly. Maybe. He lifted both arms toward the sky. But you are coming with me. The entire world convulsed. The fissures collapsed inward. The sky imploded, pulling the spiraled fractals into a single vortex. Light consumed the ground. The entity thrashed, screaming in 100 overlapping voices. The volunteers reached through the glowing doorway, shouting Ethan's name until their voices vanished into the collapse. Ethan felt the architecture crumple under the force of both their wills. He felt himself splitting. He felt everything splitting. Then, as the vortex swallowed the last fragment of the threshold, he let go. There was no light, no sound, no world, only the aftershock of collapse ringing through whatever remained of Ethan Ward's awareness. The threshold had folded inward, the entity pulled with it, and Ethan had surrendered himself to the implosion. For one impossible moment, he felt everything, millions of images stitched together, the dreams of strangers, the fears of sleepers, the silent spaces between waking thoughts, the hollow echo of the entity screaming as its reality fractured. Then, abruptly, the pressure vanished. Ethan opened his eyes. He lay on a cold metal floor, not glowing, not shifting, not fracturing. Metal, real, cold. He blinked slowly as shapes formed around him. A ceiling of reinforced steel, fluorescent lights flickering weakly, a wall with peeling paint, a door with a rusted handle. It was a room, a real room, a room he knew, the observation chamber, but not the same one. This version was abandoned, empty, silent. Dust coated every surface. The biometric chairs were broken, toppled like discarded skeletons. The glass observation window had fractured in a spider web pattern, not from something breaking out, but breaking in. Ethan sat up, wincing as pain crackled through his ribs. His muscles throbbed, his mind pulsed with a dull ache. But he was alive. He was whole. Rachel, Hannah, Marcus, Oliver, Jonah. He struggled to his feet, leaning against the wall. Panic surged through him. Had they escaped the threshold? Had the doorway led them back to reality or somewhere else? Ethan staggered toward the cracked glass. The observation deck beyond was cold and dark. Dust floated like ash in the air. His reflection stared back at him, pale, exhausted, but unmistakably human. A whisper crawled up his spine. You survived. He froze. That voice, not layered, not monstrous, human. He turned sharply. A figure sat in the corner of the room, half hidden in the shadows. The dim light revealed the shape of a woman, knees pulled to her chest, arms wrapped around them, hair hanging over her face. Her breathing was shallow, almost too quiet to hear. Ethan approached slowly. Rachel. She lifted her head. Her eyes met his. Ethan. She stumbled toward him and collapsed into his arms. Her body shook uncontrollably, her clothes torn, her skin cold, but she was alive, real, human. No carved smile, no shadow behind her eyes, just fear, raw fear. Ethan held her tightly. You made it out. You are safe now." She shook her head, breath trembling. "The others, Ethan, they did not come through the same door. I do not know where they are." Ethan felt a sharp, twisting dread. He squeezed her gently. "We will find them. We will." A sound interrupted him, a metallic scrape. Then another. Footsteps, slow, uneven. Ethan moved Rachel behind him instinctively. A silhouette appeared in the doorway. For an instant, Ethan's heart stopped. But it was not the entity, not a volunteer, not a monster. A security officer stood there, uniform torn, eyes bloodshot, face unnervingly pale. His breathing was shallow as he stepped into the room. "Sir, Dr. Ward, I cannot believe you are alive." Ethan stared hard, unwilling to trust too quickly. "Who else is here?" The man swallowed. "I have been searching for survivors. Most of the facility is destroyed. Systems offline. Structural collapse in 3 sectors. Something happened underground. Something impossible." Ethan exchanged a look with Rachel. The threshold's implosion had reached the physical world. The officer's gaze moved to Rachel. "I am glad someone else made it. You two need to come with me." Before Ethan could respond, the officer lifted a hand, a trembling hand, pointing at Ethan. "You have something inside you." Ethan froze. Rachel stepped back in fear. The officer's voice cracked. "I saw it when you turned. Your shadow. It is wrong." Ethan looked down. The fluorescent light cast his shadow against the opposite wall, but the shadow did not match his movements. His hand lifted. The shadow lagged a second behind. The officer staggered backward. No. You were with it. You were part of the breach." Rachel grabbed Ethan's arm. "Ethan, the threshold. It marked you." The officer raised his weapon not to fire, but to aim, shaking violently. "Stay where you are." Ethan stepped forward desperately. "I am not possessed. I fought it. I closed the threshold." The shadow behind them twitched. Rachel gasped. Ethan turned slowly. The shadow stretched upward on the wall. It elongated, bent, twisted, no longer matching Ethan's body at all. The officer screamed, "Get away from me." His finger tightened on the trigger. Rachel lunged, shoving Ethan aside just as bang! The bullet tore into the wall behind Ethan. Ethan threw himself at the officer, knocking the weapon away. The man fell to the floor, sobbing, shaking uncontrollably. "It is inside you. It is inside you. It is inside you." Ethan held him down. "Listen to me. If it were inside me, you would already be dead. I am still me. Do you hear me? I am still me." The officer stared into Ethan's eyes, searching, terrified. Then something changed. His eyes widened. His breath froze. He looked past Ethan, upward. Ethan turned. The shadow on the wall was moving on its own. It peeled itself upward like a sheet of ink coming loose from paper. It shifted into a humanoid form, featureless, dark, but unmistakably echoing Ethan's frame. It tilted its head. A distorted whisper filled the room. Halfway, Ethan stepped back, horrified. "That is not me." Rachel grabbed his sleeve. "Ethan, you brought something back." The officer scrambled to his feet and ran, screaming down the hallway. His footsteps vanished into the darkness. The shadow figure did not chase him. It stayed, watching Ethan. It lifted a hand. Ethan felt his own arm twitch. He forced it down. The shadow paused. Its head tilted again. Then it melted back into the wall, gone. Rachel clung to him, trembling. What was that? Ethan's voice shook. Not the entity, not entirely. Something left behind. A shard, a trace. Rachel whispered. The threshold is not fully closed. Ethan nodded slowly. Not yet. They stood in silence as the flickering lights buzzed softly overhead. Somewhere in the facility, metal groaned. Somewhere else, a low humming began faint, but rising, and Ethan understood. The entity had not finished crossing. It had only begun. For several long seconds, Ethan Ward could not move. The shadow that had pulled itself from the wall, his shadow that was not his, had vanished as silently as it appeared. But its absence weighed on the room like a pressure system preparing for a storm. Rachel clung to his arm, trembling, her breath shallow and uneven. Dust drifted lazily through the flickering fluorescent light. As if time itself had thickened, Ethan forced himself to breathe. It was not the entity, he whispered, though the words tasted hollow, not fully. Rachel stepped back enough to look into his eyes. What does that mean? What did we bring back? Ethan wiped a shaking hand across his forehead. The threshold collapsed, but it was built from thought, from consciousness. Pieces of it could attach themselves to minds, to shadows, to me. Rachel's face tightened. Ethan, before he could respond, a deep metallic groan vibrated through the entire observation chamber. The floor shuddered. Dust drifted from the ceiling fixtures. A faint hum rose from somewhere in the facility, a low, resonant tune like a distant engine beginning to stir. Rachel whispered, horrified, "It's waking up." Ethan moved toward the cracked glass window and peered into the abandoned observation deck. The hum grew steadier. Something in the air shifted pressure, temperature, the movement of dusk. The world began aligning with an unseen pulse. He felt it in his bones. The threshold may have begun to rebuild itself. Ethan grabbed Rachel's hand. "We need to move. Now." They slipped out of the ruined chamber and into the hallway. The lights buzzed sharply overhead, flickering in a rapid stutter. The corridor ahead twisted with shadows, not figures but shapes, angles, impressions of movement that retreated just as quickly as they appeared. Rachel tightened her grip on him. "Ethan, is that it?" He shook his head. "Not yet. Those are only echoes." "Echoes of what?" Ethan swallowed. "Echoes of what is trying to reform." He guided her down the hallway, boots crunching over shattered glass and debris. The entire facility seemed altered, like it had shifted slightly out of sync with itself. Corners looked sharper, hallways longer. Doors seemed to breathe faintly as though expanding and contracting. Ethan stopped. The air was moving, not from ventilation, from the walls. Rachel covered her mouth, eyes wide. "Oh my God." The hallway exhaled, a soft, warm draft brushing past their legs. The lights flickered in time with the pulse. Ethan whispered, "It's synchronizing with me, with your mind." "No." With whatever piece came back, he took a shaky step forward. As he moved, the hallway's pulse quickened, matching the rhythm of his steps. The walls throbbed lightly with each movement. Rachel grabbed his arm again. "Ethan, it's reacting to you. You cannot keep moving like this. You are feeding it." We do not have a choice. They continued down the corridor. Emergency signs were peeling off the walls, swaying as if tugged by invisible hands. A door creaked open slowly as they passed, not mechanically, organically. A slow, deliberate invitation. Rachel shuddered. "We are not going in there." Ethan agreed instantly. They pushed deeper into the facility, passing rooms that had once held scientific equipment now twisted into unrecognizable shapes. Screens flickered with static, occasionally flashing Ethan's face distorted, smiling with the too wide carved grin. Ethan forced himself to look away each time. They finally reached the central stairwell, but the metal steps had warped into a spiraled shape that bent like bone instead of steel. Rachel whispered, "We cannot go down like this." "No." He scanned the area. A damaged utility elevator sat at the end of the hallway. The doors were jammed open, revealing the emergency ladder running vertically down the shaft. Ethan gestured. "This way. If the others survived, they'll try to regroup near the main entrance. We need to meet them." Rachel nodded and climbed into the shaft. Ethan followed, wincing as pain shot down his shoulder. He gripped the ladder tightly. The hum grew louder. A faint scraping echoed behind them. Rachel froze on the ladder. "Ethan, something is following us." He looked up past her. The shaft was empty, quiet, but the scraping continued, echoing upward, metal against metal, slow, rhythmic, like a hand dragging along the ladder rails. He swallowed. "Keep moving." They descended quickly. The scraping grew faster, angry, closer. Rachel gasped as something tugged lightly on her hair. She slapped at the air, but nothing was there. Ethan saw it a second later, a ripple in the darkness below them, not a shape, but a distortion, something unseen, something shadow-born, the fragment of threshold he carried. It had followed them into the shaft. Ethan punched downward with his boot, hitting nothing, but the scraping stopped, then resumed, louder, closer. Rachel's breathing turned frantic. "It is trying to drag us back," Ethan shouted. "Move." They slid the final 10 feet and dropped into the sub-level hallway. Rachel stumbled but caught herself. Ethan spun, slamming the emergency gate shut over the ladder opening. The scraping stopped on the other side. A single whisper leaked through the grate. "Ethan." His blood ran cold. Rachel stepped back, terrified. "That is not the entity, but it is part of it." He nodded grimly. "A residue, a shadow echo, and it is bound to me. We cannot stay here. It will come through eventually." They ran through the dim hallway, passing flickering lights and buckled floors. Something was wrong with the air here, heavier, vibrating with faint tremors. They turned a corner and Ethan skidded to a stop. Rachel gasped. Ahead of them, the corridor opened into the facility's central atrium, but the atrium was no longer a room. It had become a cavity, a void filled with writhing darkness. Tendrils of shadow stretched across the ceiling like roots. The floor had split open into deep fissures, glowing faintly with red light, as if the threshold's architecture had begun rebuilding itself in the waking world. Rachel shook her head, stepping back. "Ethan, this is impossible." "No, this is the threshold trying to anchor, trying to grow." A low hum swelled across the atrium. The shadows tightened, the red glow brightened. Rachel whispered, "If this grows any further..." It will consume the facility and then everything else. Ethan clenched his fists. We must find the others, and we must stop this now. Rachel nodded, though fear trembled in her eyes. But before they could take another step, something rose from the fissure. Not the entity, not the volunteers. Something else. A shape made of pure shadow, bound loosely into Ethan's silhouette. It shimmered with broken geometry. It stood on the edge of the glowing crack, head tilted, staring at him with eyes that did not exist. Rachel grabbed Ethan's hand. "Ethan, it is calling you." The shadow lifted a hand. The fissures widened, the lights blew out, and the atrium began to breathe. The atrium breathed. Not metaphorically, not as a hallucination. It expanded and contracted with slow, deliberate inhales that stirred dust clouds and bent metal beams like softened clay. Ethan Ward stood frozen with Rachel beside him, both staring into the vast cavity where the heart of the facility once existed. Darkness writhed through the chamber, weaving itself between broken support columns and shattered walkways. Red fissures pulsed beneath the fractured floor, glowing like veins feeding an organism hungry for form. Rachel clutched Ethan's arm. "Ethan, that thing. It looks like you." The silhouette across the fissure, Ethan's shadow that was not his, stood perfectly still, but the darkness forming its body was alive, shifting like smoke trapped in the shape of a man. The edges flickered with broken geometry, flickering at angles no silhouette should take. It stood on the trembling lip of the glowing fissure, head tilted just slightly, as if calculating how to reach him. Ethan's breath shook. "It is not me. It is not human. It is a residue, a remnant of the threshold, a construct pulled from the collapse and anchored to him." Rachel swallowed hard. "It wants you." The silhouette lifted its arm. The fissures widened. A deep rumble shook the atrium as tiles cracked like eggshells. Darkness spilled upward in tendrils, wriggling like fingers eager to crawl across the floor. Ethan grabbed Rachel's hand. "We need to move now." The humming air shifted behind them, too sudden, too sharp. Ethan turned. A figure limped into view. Hannah. Her clothes were torn, stained with dust and blood. Her eyes were stunned, vacant, but her steps were deliberate as she stumbled toward them. Rachel gasped and rushed forward, catching Hannah before she collapsed entirely. "Hannah! God! Hannah! You are alive!" Hannah clung to her weakly. It pushed us out. All of us. Marcus and Oliver went one way, Jonah another. We scattered when the world broke apart, and then it kept pulling. It kept trying to make us sleep. Ethan felt his pulse spike. The threshold was rebuilding itself, reaching for the volunteers it had marked. Hannah looked up at Ethan, and it kept calling your name. Ethan stiffened. Behind him, the silhouette twitched violently, its body distorting like a recording glitch. Its head snapped toward Hannah, then toward Rachel, then back to Ethan, as if trying to interpret the others, but failing, because they were not the one it was meant for. Rachel pulled Hannah close. "Can you walk?" Hannah nodded weakly, but her eyes drifted to the shadow again, dread cutting through her exhaustion. "It sees us." "No," Ethan said quietly. "It sees only me." The ground trembled again. A massive crack shot across the atrium floor, splitting it into two uneven levels. Metal screeched overhead as a support beam snapped, crashing into the void and disappearing into the writhing darkness below. Ethan pointed toward a side exit. "We have to go now." They ran, boots pounding across trembling tiles. The air quivered as the humidity shifted, like the space itself was breathing harder. When they reached the exit corridor, a violent crash shook the atrium. Ethan risked a glance back. The shadow had moved, no longer across the fissure, now at the edge of the doorway they had just escaped through. Rachel screamed, "Ethan, it is following you." The shadow stepped into the hallway. No footsteps, no sound. It moved like a smear of darkness dragged forward by an invisible force. Ethan shouted, "Go! Move!" They sprinted through the corridor as lights flickered violently overhead. The walls pulsed in rhythm with Ethan's heartbeat. Each time his foot struck the ground, the hallway responded, shifting, bending, warping like fluid. Rachel grabbed Hannah, dragging her along as they fled deeper into the facility. The hum grew louder, the shadow grew faster. Ethan turned a corner and skidded to a halt. Standing ahead of them were Marcus and Oliver, both bruised and shaken but conscious. Marcus had a makeshift bandage wrapped around his arm. Oliver supported him with one shoulder. Rachel shouted their names, relief breaking through panic. Oliver staggered forward. We heard the threshold. It woke up. We ran, but Marcus's gaze locked onto Ethan, and fear flashed in his eyes. He pointed with a trembling hand. "Behind you." Ethan turned. The shadow was only 20 feet away, now shaped more clearly than before, shoulders forming, limbs sharpening, the outline of a face flickering into existence. Rachel backed away in terror. "Ethan, it is becoming you." "No," Ethan whispered. "It is becoming real." The shadow stretched an arm toward him, and Ethan felt something tug at his chest, like an invisible hook catching his rib cage. His vision blurred. His knees buckled. Rachel grabbed him. "Ethan." Hannah looked around wildly. "What does it want?" Marcus whispered. "It wants to step through." Ethan steadied himself, teeth clenched. "With me, through me. It needs a vessel to anchor, and I am the closest thing it has." Oliver shook his head violently. "No, you cannot let it." The shadow advanced, growing taller with every step. Its body flickered like a glitching projection, stabilizing in real time. Ethan forced a breath. There must be a place where the anchor is strongest, a place where it is trying to form fully. If we can reach it, we can cut it off. Rachel held his arm tightly. "And if we cannot, then it finishes crossing." The facility shifted violently, shaking dust from the ceiling. Pipes groaned. The walls bent inward momentarily, then snapped back into shape. Oliver pointed down the hallway, the main server nexus. That is where the signals converged. If the threshold is trying to rebuild, it will be there. Ethan nodded. "Then we go." They ran again, Marcus limping, Hannah clutching her ribs, Rachel staying beside Ethan as though afraid he might vanish. The shadow followed relentlessly, gliding rather than walking, always closing the gap. The corridor ahead dipped into darkness. Ethan stepped forward, The lights exploded overhead, not from force, from resonance. Every bulb burst simultaneously, plunging the hallway into dim emergency light. Rachel screamed because the walls were breathing again, like lungs surrounding them. The facility exhaled, and Ethan's shadow elongated across the floor, stretching until it merged with the one pursuing them. The merging shadows twitched, and then the pursuing figure grew. It doubled in size, reaching the ceiling. Its head scraped metal with a shrill screech. Marcus shouted, "Ethan, it is feeding on you." Ethan staggered. His knees hit the floor as something deep in his skull pulsed with burning pressure. Rachel knelt beside him. "Ethan, look at me. Stay with me." The shadow reached toward him. A massive tremor ripped through the hallway. The floor split beneath the creature. Darkness poured upward from the crack like smoke under pressure. The shadow reeled backward, its form destabilizing for a moment. Oliver pointed. "Now, move." Ethan forced himself upright. They sprinted through the last stretch of corridor, the server nexus doors looming ahead. The shadow roared behind them. Not a sound, a vibration, a pulse of pure intent that shook the hallway and cracked the floor tiles. They reached the nexus doors. Marcus and Oliver shoved them open, while Rachel dragged Ethan through. Hannah stumbled inside moments later. The heavy doors slammed shut. Silence fell. Only their ragged breathing filled the massive cylindrical chamber, once the core of Project Somnus, now dark, abandoned, but intact. Ethan collapsed against a console. Rachel knelt beside him, gripping his shoulders. "Ethan, tell me you are still you." His voice was barely a whisper. "I am trying." The hum returned, faint at first, then louder, a resonance vibrating inside the chamber walls. The shadow had found the door. It was coming, and it was no longer just a shadow. The humming inside the server nexus deepened into a low, resonant vibration that traveled through the metal walls and into Ethan Ward's bones. The cylindrical chamber, once the technological heart of Project Somnus, now felt like the inside of a colossal machine preparing to awaken. Faint sparks crackled along the dead monitors. Dust drifted in currents that didn't match the air vents. Something unseen breathed beneath the floor. Rachel knelt beside Ethan, gripping his shoulders tightly. "Ethan, talk to me. Are you still with us?" Ethan's breath came shallow, uneven. He forced his head up to meet her eyes. "I am here. I am still me." But he felt it, a weight behind his thoughts, a second rhythm, like another mind knocking inside his skull. Hannah leaned against the console nearby, pale and trembling. She wiped a smear of blood from her cheek. "It followed us here. The threshold remnant. The shadow. It wants something from you." Marcus surveyed the chamber, jaw tight. "We must find a way to push it out, to cut the tether." Oliver stepped forward, voice shaking. "Except the tether is Ethan. It is using him as the anchor." The words hit Ethan like a blow. Rachel glared at Oliver. "That is not helping." But Oliver shook his head. He must hear it. He must understand what is happening to him. Ethan pushed against the floor, rising unsteadily. I know, believe me, I know. The hum intensified. Rachel looked toward the sealed Nexus doors. It's here. A shadow seeped through the narrow gap under the metal frame, sliding like ink spreading across paper. Ethan felt his heart lurch. The shadow thickened. Rose took shape. His shape. The remnant silhouette stood taller now, body weaving itself into clearer lines. Its limbs sharpened, its torso tightened, its head lifted until the outline of a face formed almost human, except for the eyes. Where eyes should have existed, there were two spiraling voids, swallowing light. It spoke without sound. Ethan. Everyone stepped back except Ethan, whose legs refused to obey. Fear coiled inside him, but beneath the fear was something darker. Recognition, like staring at a memory that was not his, but had been forced into him. Rachel stepped forward. Get away from him. The shadow turned its head slowly toward her. Rachel recoiled, breath catching. She felt it not in sight, but in her thoughts. Cold, hollow, searching. The shadow's head snapped back to Ethan. Ethan steeled himself. What do you want? Why did you follow? The shadow moved one step forward, and the steel beneath it dented inward. It lifted a hand, mirroring Ethan's posture for an instant before diverging. Its fingers elongated into tendrils of darkness. It whispered inside his mind, "Finish crossing." Ethan staggered backward, clutching his skull. The voice reverberated like a memory bleeding into the present. Rachel grabbed him. Ethan, stay with me. Do not let it in. Marcus and Oliver pulled Rachel back gently. Seeing Ethan's face contort with pain, Hannah whispered, "It is trying to merge." Ethan forced himself upright, breathing through the pressure. Why me? Why not return to the void? Why not go back to what created you? The shadow's body flickered, glitching between silhouettes, volunteers, strangers. Then Ethan again, as though trying to build an identity from borrowed shapes. Because you dreamed of us. Ethan froze. Rachel gasped, "Ethan, what did you do?" Ethan shook his head. Panicked. I did not dream of it. I studied the patterns. I tried to understand consciousness. I mapped the border between waking thought and suppressed cognition. I never meant to open anything, but the shadow whispered again. Intent is irrelevant. You called. We answered. The Nexus walls vibrated violently. Dust cascaded from the ceiling. The dead monitors flickered to life, each displaying the same growing waveform, pulsing in resonance with Ethan's heartbeat. Marcus shouted, "Look!" The waveforms synchronized into a symbol one Ethan recognized from the white plane, from the mind architecture that belonged to the threshold. The Nexus itself was responding to him, amplifying the presence inside him. Hannah's voice cracked. "Ethan, you are becoming a transmitter." Rachel turned to Ethan, terrified. "You must shut it down, now, before it uses you to finish crossing." The shadow moved closer. Ethan stepped back. It matched his movement perfectly. It did not walk, it slid. Reality bent around it. He backed into the central console. The metal was cold under his palms. Something within the core hummed in reply. A flicker of light ran through the cables, obeying him. rather than the shadow. He understood immediately. The Nexus was not amplifying the shadow. It was waiting for Ethan to choose. Rachel squeezed his wrist. "Ethan, do something," he inhaled sharply. "If the Nexus amplifies identity, I can push back. I can define myself. Force it out." Oliver shouted. "How?" Ethan's voice was strained but certain. "By holding my mind together." Rachel cupped his face with shaking hands. "Then do not you dare let go." The shadow stiffened, sensing Ethan's resolve. The spiraling voids where eyes should be widened. It extended both arms, fingers unraveling into ribbons of darkness that spread toward Ethan. The moment they touched the floor, the fissures glowed red. The threshold was growing. Hannah screamed. "It is forcing its world through him." Marcus grabbed a fallen metal rod and threw it at the shadow. It passed straight through, absorbed like water. Oliver grabbed another and hurled it. Same result. Rachel stepped between Ethan and the approaching shadow. "You cannot have him." The shadow froze. Then something unexpected happened. It recoiled. Not from Rachel, from Ethan. Ethan's mind surged not in collapse, but in clarity. He felt every pattern he had mapped, every symbol he had seen, every structure the threshold had revealed. They aligned inside him like a lock clicking open. "I am not your vessel." The shadow convulsed violently. Rachel backed away as Ethan lifted both hands. The Nexus lights flickered, then surged bright white. The waveforms on the monitors distorted as Ethan's pulse accelerated. Hannah gasped. "Ethan, your shadow." His real shadow separated from the floor. It lifted, it thickened, it solidified into a second silhouette. His true one made not of darkness, but of light. Rachel whispered. "It is fighting back." Ethan clenched his fists, and the two shadows, one of light, one of darkness, collided in the center of the room. The shockwave slammed the volunteers into the walls. Ethan stumbled, but stayed upright as the two forces wrestled, light shredding darkness, darkness absorbing light. The shadow entity lunged toward Ethan, but his light shadow blocked it. The chamber filled with violent arcs of energy. Rachel screamed. "Ethan!" Ethan shouted through gritted teeth. "I am not yours." The light shadow pushed the darkness back toward the fissures reopening under the floor. The dark shadow shrieked without sound, limbs splitting and reforming wildly. Ethan raised his voice again, his identity solidifying with every breath. "I choose who I am, not you, not the threshold, not the void." Light exploded outward from his chest, slamming into the dark entity. The shadow ruptured, fragments scattering, the fissures sealed. The humming stopped, and the room fell silent. Ethan collapsed to his knees. Gasping, Rachel rushed to him, pulling him into her arms. "Ethan, Ethan, look at me." He lifted his head slowly. His shadow sat normally behind him. Only one. "His," Rachel cried in relief. "Marcus, Oliver," and Hannah gathered around, breathless. For a moment, the Nexus was calm, but then, somewhere deep below the facility, a low rumbling began again. Not the shadow, not the remnant, something older, something waiting behind the threshold Ethan had forced shut, and it had noticed what he just did. The rumbling rose from the deepest levels of the facility, a low seismic growl that rippled through the server nexus, like the exhale of something vast awakening from centuries of sleep. Dust rained from the ceiling. Metal beams groaned as if under crushing weight. Ethan Ward stood frozen, Rachel gripping his arm tightly while Marcus, Oliver, and Hannah steadied themselves against consoles that flickered with dying embers of light. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest. This was not the shadow remnant, not the fractured piece of the threshold he had forced out. This vibration felt older, rooted in the bones of the world, something beneath the threshold, something that existed before the crossing even had a name. Hannah whispered, "It is still here." Ethan shook his head. "No, this is not the same presence. This is deeper." Marcus turned to him sharply. "How can there be something deeper than the threshold?" Ethan stared at the trembling floor. The threshold was a bridge, not a starting point. Something had to exist on the other side, something we have not seen yet. Oliver stepped closer to the center of the chamber, eyes fixed downward. Then the shadow was never the real danger. Another tremor struck. A nearby console toppled over with a metallic crash. Rachel pulled Ethan toward her, fear in her voice. "If something else is coming, we have to get out of this room." But before anyone could move, the floor split down the middle. Not cracked, split, clean and precise, as though cut by an invisible blade. A fissure opened across the nexus, glowing with a pulsating red that seemed to breathe with its own rhythm. The hum deepened until it became a throbbing pulse, matching Ethan's heartbeat. Ethan stumbled backward. No, this is impossible." We closed it. I closed it. The fissure widened, swallowing cables and broken equipment. The red glow seeped upward in thick tendrils. The air vibrated with low harmonic resonance. Rachel gripped Ethan's wrist. "Ethan, listen to me. This is not your fault." But Ethan's eyes were locked on the fissure. It was growing. Hannah stepped back as another slab of metal fell into the widening crack. "It is forming again. The threshold is rebuilding." Oliver shook his head violently. "But who is rebuilding it? The shadow is gone." Ethan swallowed hard. "Not someone. Something." Marcus stiffened. "The entity behind the entity." Ethan stared at him. "Exactly." Another tremor slammed through the room. Rachel almost fell. Ethan caught her, the two of them steadying each other. Then something rose from the fissure, not a silhouette, not a shadow, a shape of pure red light, tall and narrow, like a column of molten code. Symbols spiraled along its length, ancient and unreadable. The fissure bent around it, warping reality as if space were stretching to accommodate its presence. Hannah stepped back in horror. "That is not like the shadow," Marcus whispered. "It is the door, a living door." Ethan felt the truth settle like ice in his veins. The threshold was only a gate. This was the frame, a pillar of consciousness older than the entity he fought, a structure that existed before minds knew how to dream, a frequency that predated thought itself. The door pulsed, a wave of distortion spread through the room. Screens exploded, metal warped. Ethan felt his body tug toward it as if gravity were shifting. The door was calling him. Rachel grabbed him with both arms. "Ethan, stay with me, stay with me." His voice cracked. "I cannot." It is not pulling me. I am resonating with it, Oliver shouted. Then kill the resonance. Ethan slammed his palms into the floor, trying to ground himself, but the vibration intensified. The door pulsed again, brighter, stronger. Hannah screamed, "It is choosing him." Marcus yelled, "Stop fighting and think. What does it want?" Ethan's vision blurred. The symbols on the pillar-like door reorganized in patterns he recognized from the mindscape. The white plane, the fractal storms behind the crossing. It was not opening to consume him. It was opening because he activated it. Rachel tightened her grip, voice trembling. "Ethan, look at me. We stop this together." Ethan forced himself to meet her eyes. Her presence grounded him, pulled him back into himself. He gripped her hands, anchoring his thoughts. Then another pulse boomed through the chamber. The door expanded. A second pillar rose beside it. Then a third. Rachel gasped. "Ethan, it is multiplying." Marcus stepped back until he hit the wall. "I think these are layers. Layers of whatever world was trying to come through." Oliver's voice cracked. "Then how many layers are there?" As if answering him, a fourth pillar erupted from the fissure, glowing brighter than the rest. The symbols rippled in perfect synchrony with Ethan's racing pulse. He staggered. "It is not just calling me, it is mirroring me. The threshold remnant tied me to this frequency." Rachel's eyes widened. "Then break the tie. Break it now." Ethan closed his eyes, concentrating, trying to isolate the foreign rhythm inside him. But instead of resisting, something else happened. He understood it, not the meaning, the structure. He could see how the resonance shaped itself around thought, how the pillars anchored their existence to conscious awareness. They were not just openings, they were reflections. They mirrored the minds they touched. Ethan whispered, "I think I can close them." Hannah grabbed his arm. "Ethan, we saw what closing the first threshold did to you. It nearly killed you." Rachel cupped his face, fear raw in her eyes. "If you try again." Ethan nodded weakly. "I know." Marcus pointed at the expanding fissure. "Then what choice do we have? If these things finish forming, the entity will not need to cross. The world will fall into them." Oliver shouted above the rising hum. "Ethan, do it! Close the pillars before they open completely." Ethan braced himself. He pressed both palms to the floor. He exhaled hard. The resonance inside him ignited. His pulse synced to the pillars. His breath synced. His thoughts synced. Rachel felt his body tense. "Ethan, do not dissolve into it. You hear me? Do not let it take you." Ethan pushed downward, forcing his awareness into the glowing lines beneath the fissure. The pillars flickered. He groaned as the pressure doubled, then tripled. The symbols spun faster. The fissure screamed with harmonic distortion, but the pillars responded to him. They bent, dipped, wavered. He strained harder, shouting through clenched teeth, "Close." The first pillar shattered. Light sprayed into the fissure like molten glass. Hannah gasped. "He did it." Ethan gritted his teeth. The second pillar cracked, fractured, collapsed. Marcus shouted, "Two down." The fissure pulsed violently, fighting back. The third pillar glowed dangerously bright, unstable, volatile. Ethan pushed harder. Rachel held him, anchoring him, whispering his name like a tether. The pillar exploded in a burst of red fragments. Only one remained. The fourth. It rose taller, brighter, symbols spinning in frantic spirals. Ethan screamed as he forced his mind against it. It resisted. Then it snapped. The pillar imploded, collapsing into the fissure in a spiral of shattered symbols. Silence. The fissure dimmed. The resonance faded. Ethan collapsed forward into Rachel's arms, trembling violently. Then a whisper curled up from the fissure. Not Ethan, not shadow, not entity. Something older, something waiting, something that had lost its doorway and now wanted a new one. Silence pressed down on the server nexus like a physical weight. The shimmering fragments of the destroyed pillars faded into the fissure, their dying glow reflecting off twisted metal and shattered screens. Ethan Ward lay trembling in Rachel's arms, every breath scraping like gravel in his throat. His mind buzzed with static, fractured echoes of symbols he was never meant to comprehend. But beneath the silence, something whispered, not loud, not urgent, just alive. Rachel brushed Ethan's hair back, her voice thin with fear. Ethan, look at me. Stay here. Stay with us. He swallowed hard, forcing his mind to focus. I am here, but the truth was heavier. Something else was here too. Something watching through the cracks in thought, something older than the threshold, something that had waited beneath the door he had just closed. Marcus's voice broke the silence. I felt it when the last pillar collapsed. Something moved below us. Oliver stepped back from the fissure, shaking. If that thing is worse than the threshold, then what did we just wake up? Hannah's eyes were fixed on the dark seam where the floor had split. Her voice trembled. It was not waking, it was listening. Ethan forced himself upright despite Rachel's protests. His limbs felt hollow, every nerve stretched thin. He approached the edge of the fissure. The red glow had vanished, replaced by a faint, cold luminescence, shifting like pale embers caught in a draft. Rachel grabbed his wrist. Do not get close. Please. Ethan nodded, but didn't step back. Something in the fissure tugged at him, not dragging, not compelling, just recognizing, like pressure at the back of the skull. Then the whisper came again, not a shadow's whisper, not the entity's layered voice. Something deeper, rough, ancient, a resonance that did not speak in words, but in intention. Ethan, his pulse spiked. Rachel stiffened. Ethan, I heard it too. Marcus and Oliver exchanged horrified looks. Hannah whispered, it is in all of us. The fissure pulsed. A thin tendril of pale light stretched upward, flickering like a dying spark. Then another, then another. They braided together, forming a vertical thread thicker than a rope, but made of something not physical, something that shifted between states like liquid thought. It swayed gently in the air. Oliver stumbled backward. What is that? Marcus breathed. A conduit. Hannah shook her head violently. No, a hand. Ethan felt the truth hit his chest like a blow. It was trying to rise. The thread twisted sharply. Cracks crawled across the floor around it, lines of pale energy that pulsed in patterns like a heart trying to beat. The fissure expanded again, groaning under pressure. Rachel shouted, Ethan, do something. He shut his eyes, trying to suppress the resonance inside him. The pillars had collapsed, but the imprint they left behind remained embedded in his mind like a scar. The older presence beneath the threshold could feel it, could track it, could climb through it. Ethan dropped to his knees, pressing both hands against the cold floor. He forced his consciousness outward, trying to silence the rhythm the fissure was following. He imagined walls, barriers. He pictured the structure of the threshold collapsing inward, sealing itself. The fissure pulsed harder. Rachel knelt beside him. Ethan, stop! You are hurting yourself. But he kept pushing, and then it spoke more clearly. Not Ethan, not through him, through all of them. You opened the door of the small one. Oliver clapped his hands over his ears. Make it stop. Marcus doubled over, teeth clenched. It is inside our skulls. Rachel held Ethan tightly. Do not let it in, please. Ethan forced himself to breathe, to steady his mind through the pressure. Who are you? The fissure pulsed. We were before the shadow. We were before the crossing. We have waited with no name. Hannah stumbled back until she hit a console. It is older than the threshold. The threshold was only its reflection. Marcus whispered through clenched teeth. Ethan, we should run. Oliver shook his head in terror. Where? There is nowhere left. Ethan forced more strength into his voice. Why now? Why come through now? The fissure cracked open wider only an inch, but enough to release a rush of cold air that smelled like memory burned to ash. Because the voice shuddered through the nexus. The child of resonance has returned. Rachel gripped Ethan so tightly her knuckles whitened. It is talking about you. Marcus stared at Ethan with sudden clarity. Ethan, when the threshold collapsed, you didn't just close it. You touched what was underneath. Oliver choked out, and now it wants you. The pale tendril of light surged upward another few inches, splitting into branching shapes like fingers forming. The floor trembled. Ethan's blood turned to ice. Rachel, Hannah, Marcus, Oliver, get back! They obeyed instantly. Ethan pressed both palms to the floor again despite the searing pain exploding up his arms. He pushed his consciousness outward, not into patterns this time, but into silence, into negation, into a void that belonged to him alone. The fissure faltered. The tendril dimmed. The chamber held its breath. Rachel whispered, Ethan, what are you doing? Ethan's voice strained. If it is climbing through resonance, I can starve it. I can flatten the signal. But he felt resistance immediately. The ancient presence pushed back, sending a wave of pressure through the fissure that nearly knocked him unconscious. It spoke again. You are the thin point, the break in the wall. You cannot stop us. Ethan shouted through clenched teeth. I closed your pillars. I can close you. The fissure pulsed violently, cracking the floor another foot. Rachel screamed, Ethan, get away from it. But the white tendril lunged, not at the group, at Ethan. Light lashed upward, striking him across the chest like a whip of frozen fire. Ethan flew backward, crashing into a metal column with a sickening thud. Rachel sprinted to him, dropping to her knees. Ethan, stay awake, please. His chest burned. His vision swam. He tasted blood. The ancient voice echoed through the nexus. The door is not yet broken. Marcus grabbed a fallen steel pipe, brandishing it despite shaking hands. "What do? We cannot fight a thing like that." Oliver pulled Rachel back as the fissure pulsed again. "We have to get him out of here before it fully rises." Hannah pointed toward the far end of the chamber. "There, an auxiliary control room. We can reach it through the maintenance tunnel." Rachel shouted. Move now." Oliver and Marcus lifted Ethan between them. Rachel supported his head. Hannah cleared the path, kicking debris aside. Behind them, the fissure erupted with a deeper, more guttural rumble. The ancient voice whispered one more time, now almost gentle. "You cannot leave." Ethan coughed blood and forced his eyes open. "Watch me." They ran as the fissure tore wider, pale tendrils thrashing like limbs searching blindly. The walls shook, the ceiling buckled, emergency lights exploded overhead, showering sparks across the floor. Rachel screamed over the noise. Faster! The maintenance tunnel door came into view. Marcus and Oliver shoved Ethan through first. Hannah leapt in after him. Rachel slammed the door shut, just as a tendril slammed into the frame from the other side. The impact bent the metal inward, but the door held. For now, in the darkness of the tunnel, their ragged breaths echoed like the beginning of a countdown. Something older than the threshold had awakened, something that wanted Ethan not as a vessel, but as the missing piece of its doorway. The maintenance tunnel stretched ahead, like the throat of a sleeping beast, narrow, metallic, humming faintly with the aftershock of the fissure exploding behind them. Ethan Ward's breaths came shallow and ragged, each inhale scraping across the bruised, burning mark where the pale tendril had struck him. Rachel kept one hand on his face and the other bracing his shoulder, guiding him through the darkness, while Oliver and Marcus supported him under each arm. Hannah brought up the rear, glancing back at the warped door that pulsed under the weight of the ancient presence pushing against it. The tunnel lights flickered, once, twice, then stabilized just barely enough to reveal the fear etched on all their faces. Ethan's voice came out thin. "Do not stop. It is pushing through." Rachel shook her head fiercely. "You are hurt. You should not even be standing." Ethan forced a breath. "If I fall, it will not matter. It will reach us all." The ground trembled beneath them. A metallic shriek thundered down the tunnel as the door behind them bent inward once more, the metal groaning like something alive. The ancient voice seeped through the cracks, filling the narrow space. "Come back." The sound was not sound at all. It was memory. Weight, pressure inside the skull. The tunnel walls rippled like heat waves around them. Hannah shouted, "Move faster." They pressed on, stumbling through coils of fallen cables and broken conduits. The air grew colder, each breath forming faint fog. Ethan felt the pull in his chest intensify, a resonance he could no longer suppress. The thing beneath the threshold did not just want him, it needed him. Oliver's grip tightened. "Ethan, stay with us. Come on." Marcus looked ahead. There should be an exit hatch up here. "Keep going." But Ethan could feel the truth rising like cold water up his spine. The tunnel was bending around him, shifting, reconfiguring, responding. Rachel cried out as the walls ahead twisted into new angles, metal plates rearranging themselves in patterns that hurt to look at. The facility was no longer a structure, it was a medium, a conduit for the ancient presence. Ethan whispered, "It is using me. It is mapping the tunnel to my consciousness. It knows where we are going." Marcus cursed. "Then what do we do?" Ethan steadied himself against the wall, palm pressed to the trembling metal. The resonance from the fissure vibrated back through his bones. "We go deeper." Rachel stared at him as if he had lost his mind. "Deeper, Ethan. That thing will kill you." Ethan shook his head slowly. "No, it does not want to kill me. It wants the door open, and that means it needs me alive. That is our leverage," Oliver whispered. "Leverage for what?" Ethan lifted his gaze. "To choose the battlefield." Another tremor rippled through the tunnel, stronger this time. Dust rained from the ceiling. A distant roar reverberated through the steel, too deep and too old to belong to anything on this side of reality. Rachel's voice cracked. "Ethan, please, tell me you are not giving yourself up." He touched her cheek, his hand trembling. "I am giving us a chance." Before she could respond, the tunnel widened into a large circular chamber. A collapsed generator lay on its side. Broken catwalks hung from the ceiling like skeleton ribs. At the far end, an emergency ladder rose through the darkness. Marcus pointed. "That leads to the surface." Hannah nearly sobbed in relief, but Ethan knew better. The ladder shimmered, bent, shifted, then straightened again. The ancient presence had already touched it. The voice seeped through the chamber like a cold mist. "You cannot run from what you opened." Rachel stepped in front of Ethan instinctively. "Stop talking to him." The presence ignored her. "Only the child of resonance can free us. Only you can complete the breach." Oliver backed away. "It wants to turn Ethan into a key." Ethan felt the truth lock into place inside his mind like a final piece of a puzzle. It did not just want a doorway. It wanted transfer, a crossing, a merging. Rachel grabbed Ethan's arm. "You are not doing this. Do you hear me? You are not finishing anything for it." But Ethan looked at the chamber around them and understood something none of the others could see. The room had become the new focal point. The architecture of the threshold was forming itself again, not in light, not in pillars, but in arrangement, angles, proximity, geometry. A doorway did not need light. It needed alignment. Marcus noticed it too. "Ethan, this room, it is changing." Hannah screamed. "Look!" A crack formed in the center of the chamber floor. Pale light seeped upward like frost. The voice deepened. "Come back to the center. Complete what you began." The fissure opened wider. Rachel grabbed Ethan's shirt, shaking him. "Do not listen. Do not move. Stay with me. Stay with me." He held her hands. "Rachel, I am trying," Oliver shouted. "The ladder. Now, go!" But as he ran toward it, the metal rungs warped again, twisting into a spiral that flattened against the wall like liquid metal cooling. Oliver stumbled backward. "No, no, no, no." Hannah pointed at another door. "That one." But before she could take a step, the door dissolved into a sheet of pale light, then vanished entirely. Marcus swore, "It is sealing every exit." The fissure cracked open, releasing a gust of freezing air that extinguished the remaining lights. Darkness swallowed the chamber. The only illumination came from the pale glow leaking through the cracks in the floor, casting long shadows across their faces. Then something rose, something slow, something tall. A massive tendril of pale energy unfurled upward like the trunk of an ancient tree awakening. It spread, branching into lattices that formed shapes almost like bones, almost like architecture, almost like a colossal hand reaching toward Ethan. Rachel screamed, pulling him back. "Ethan, run!" But Ethan felt the pull again, stronger, deeper, a resonance that wanted to sync with his heartbeat. The voice filled the chamber. "We do not break worlds. We connect them. We do not destroy minds. We complete them. Let us complete you." Rachel slapped her hands over Ethan's ears. "Stop listening. Close your eyes. Do not let it in." The tendril lowered, reaching, calling, until Ethan forced a single breath. "No!" The tendril froze. Even the voice paused. Ethan rose to his feet, legs shaking, eyes burning with something fiercer than fear. Rachel stared at him in horror. "Ethan, what are you doing?" He stepped forward despite the tendrils bending eagerly toward him. "I am the resonance you want." Another step, but I choose how it ends. The fissure pulsed. Marcus yelled, "Ethan, stop!" But Ethan kept walking until he stood at the edge of the forming breach. Pale light bathed his face. He closed his eyes. Then he did the only thing he had left. He inverted the resonance. He flipped the signal inward, collapsing the pattern instead of expanding it. He turned the consciousness link into a void, a silent, untraceable absence. The tendril shook violently. The light dimmed. The voice roared through their skulls. "What are you doing?" Ethan opened his eyes, finishing what I began. He released the void pattern. The chamber erupted. Light shattered across the walls like exploding stars. Tendrils whipped in all directions, dissolving the floor. The fissure screamed as its geometry collapsed. The entire room folded inward like a crumpling metal lung. Rachel lunged toward Ethan, but the force hurled her back. Marcus, Oliver, and Hannah were thrown against the far wall. Ethan stood in the center, engulfed in spiraling light. The voice bellowed, "You break what must be open." Ethan's answer was steady, "I choose the boundary." And then everything imploded. Silence swallowed the chamber. The fissure closed. The tendrils vanished. The geometry stabilized. And where Ethan had stood, there was only a faint outline burned into the floor. Rachel crawled to it, tears falling onto the cold metal. Marcus whispered, "He saved us." Oliver fell to his knees. Hannah covered her mouth, sobbing. But then the outline flickered. Faintly, a pulse, a heartbeat. Rachel gasped, eyes widening with hope. Ethan was not gone. He was on the other side, and he was still fighting. The story ends here. Thank you for watching and listening to the whole story. Please subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell to listen to the next stories.